month of May, we chant liberation. We gather every year in the month of May, 'cause we are one black nation. And we celebrate all our victory and prepare for each new fight. We vanquish you all down better, whether black, yellow, brown or white. 'Cause black struggle international in this year time, and we want liberation now. After we struggle, I want in North America, me say we want liberation now. After we struggle, I want in the Caribbean, me say we want liberation now. After we struggle, I want in Canada, me say we want liberation now. After we struggle, I want in South America, me say we want liberation now. After we struggle, I want in Europe, me say we want liberation now. After we struggle, I want in Britain, man, me say we want liberation now. After we struggle, I want in Asia, me say we want liberation now. After we struggle, I want in Australia, me say we want liberation now. And so we trot down the road and it a cause sensation. Behind the colors of the new black nation, I step into the valleys in the shadow of the wicked, just a chant liberation. Tell it to the nation, what we want to see is Africa strong and free. We sing it in a reggae song all the time. Say what is to be has got to be. Africa shall be free. Who are we? Africans. What do we want? Freedom. And we say, how do we get it? Fight. We must fight to defend the truth and defend the right. It's Africa Liberation Day. The true black spirit is here to stay. Before this power, no one life is here. Freedom come, what me? Freedom come, what me? And the wife them who were standing by were watching fearful, wondering, saying, who are these people who walk so proud? Who are these people who chant so loud? Are these not they who live in darkness and to whom we have given light? Are these not the sons and daughters of the savage who we have taught to read and write? Have we not taught them our history and honor them with our culture? And brought them into our great house to serve and stand at our great table? Have we not granted them what they deserve? Well, African proverbs say that only those who can listen can learn, and who can hear go and feel. We are the sheep of the pasture, and now we shall inherit our land. And we are also the lion, against who none shall stand. We are the sons and daughters of the original nation that gave to this world first knowledge of civilization. We were the victim of the white savage to whom we stretch out our hand, and not knowing they came to plunder, kill and slave our people and destroy our land. So now we step it down the road and it a cause sensation. Behind the colors of the new black nation and a one chance liberation. And we say, who are we? Africans. What do we want? Freedom. And we say, how do we get it? Fight, we must fight. We defend the truth and defend the right. This is Africa Liberation Day. A true black spirit is here to stay. Without this power, no one life is there. Freedom come, what me? A freedom come, what me? A freedom come, what me? What me?
Tendai Mwadi, be thankful unto the mother, father, creative life force of the universe, Kudzai, Mudzimo, Mokoro. Give praises unto our great ancestors, Abibi Tomi, Abibi Fahodi, African power and African liberation for all African people, kings and queens. Yes, indeed. But they are inside of the building for our in our usual Zivanayi slot. And for those who are not aware, the word Zivanayi, as spoken in the Shona language, which is mostly spoken in Zimbabwe, simply means let us get to know. Yes, indeed, let us get to know each other. We're emphasizing our unity and our social relationships, kings and queens. And so we're there. It's open house, but every now and then we have a specific topic and a specific guest. And today is, one of those days, kings and queens. Yeah, we're going to be having a very, very beautiful conversation with a very powerful and knowledgeable brother in our global African community. So do stay tuned for that. Let me do the housekeeping. As you come through, we ask you to like up the video, like the video, like the video, like the video, and also share it far and wide. Share it far and wide. Check out the description to the video if you would like to contribute to our Patreon and or join our Telegram channel, whereby you'll get all your notifications as it relates to gotkushTV directly from us. Okay. Having said all of that, let me big up the chat. Shouting out to my brother Rakeem Shabazz over there at Why is the Dome TV. If you don't know about Why is the Dome, get to know about Why is the Dome. Subscribe now, yeah, immediately, and check out the beautiful, powerful conversations that our brother is having. You know what I'm saying? I want to send a shout out to brother Rakeem for a fantastic interview with brother Sam PK Collins the other day. You know what I'm saying? A brilliant brother, yeah, brilliant brother who I've had the pleasure of doing some organizing with. And so we look forward to hearing more from him. And he's got a video on this channel already, and you'll be hearing more from Sam PK throughout the development of gotkushTV, no doubt. So do stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, between time, please, yeah, check out our brother Rakeem Shabazz over there at Why is the Dome TV, and also check out the album, yeah, the Why is the Dome album. You'll get more information about that over there as well. Digging up James O in the building. Respect. Bigging up Jadorian Chimurenga, a beautiful, powerful word, Chimurenga, which is the liberation war. Another Shona word, Chimurenga, yes. Research the life and legacy of Mama Mbuya Nehanda, yeah, for a proper explanation of what that word means, brothers and sisters, okay? All right, family. By the way, anybody else, feel free to utilize the chat feature. At some point as well, we're going to be opening up the lines for you to come live and join us, should you choose to, should you so wish. It's all well and good. And yeah, man, it's going to be a powerful session. Yeah. Now, I'm a man. For those of you, many of you may be aware, I'm a practitioner and teacher of what we refer to as Sematawi, which is also referred to as Kemetic or Kemetiu or African yoga. And when I actually, kind of came across this practice as a practitioner and a teacher, I was actually looking for a martial art, okay? And so I'm very, very interested in the martial arts and their utility, their functionality, their history, and their cultural relevance, to African people, both historically, contemporarily, and into the future. And there are a few better brothers and sisters that I could find to speak on this topic than our brother Kamau Rashid. And if you know our brother, you know that he's a wellspring of wisdom on many topics, when it comes to African-centered research, African deep thoughts, Pan-African development in the area of language, agriculture. Yes, also, he's a powerful part of a powerful union, a family unit as well, brothers and sisters, and has been organizing for many, many years. He is a student of one of my greatest inspirations, to a man who I got to meet actually when I was very, very young. A man by the name of Baba Jedi Shemsu Jehuti, aka Baba Jacob Carruthers. And if you joined us yesterday, I was imploring everybody to read his books, and at least one of his books, which is Intellectual Warfare, brothers and sisters. And not only is our brother a student, but if I'm not mistaken, he's also writing a text on Baba Jedi Shemsu Jehuti as well, to bring his legacy to light. And so with that, let me bring forward, without further ado, let me bring forward to you the one and only brother Kamau Rashid. Greetings, brother.
Greetings. How are you doing today?
I'm beautiful and blessed, and even more blessed for your presence here on gotkushTV. So thank you for being here, my brother. I believe this is your first time on Gotkush, and so it won't be the last. You know what I'm saying? So do stay tuned. Yeah, we've got some work for you to do. All right. Before we get directly into the martial arts aspect of things, yeah. Just give our viewers an idea of who you are. You're a doctor. What is your expertise in that kind of field? And yeah, we'll get into the martial arts in a second.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, Kamau Rashid, I'm a professor in Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago, Illinois. Most of my, as a scholar, so as a teacher, I generally teach classes either in Africana studies or in the area that we call the foundations of education, which deals with the history and philosophy of education, as well as the sociology of education. But as a scholar, most of my work deals, I just say very broadly, with African people, our history and culture. And so because my interests tend to be very broad, my scholarship also reflects really a breadth of topics, things pertaining to such as hip hop. In fact, I was just on a panel a week ago in Madison, Wisconsin, dealing with this idea of hip hop as a healing modality. Language, of course, as you mentioned, is a vehicle of critical consciousness, and is a key element in terms of how we conceptualize as well as enact liberatory struggle. Of course, African thought in general. So to that end, I'm writing a book certainly about Jacob H. Carruthers. Actually, that book is done, making little tiny revisions to it, but hopefully sometime in the very, very near future, that book will be out here in the world. But I'm also writing a book on W.B. Du Bois as a critical thinker. John Henrik Clarke considered Du Bois to be one of the greatest African minds of the 20th century. And so I'm taking a deep dive into Du Bois thinking. And of course, I write about martial arts. I just published a paper last year on capoeira, also as a healing modality. I wanted to think beyond the martial and ask myself, what else does capoeira do? And I'm also right now engaging in a research project with a colleague of mine where we're exploring this idea in greater detail and greater depth. So that's some of what I do. Of course, in the community side, I do a lot of community education. My family has a rich history in terms of urban agriculture in the city of Chicago. Had a mill rites of passage program. So I'm very much concerned about how do we bring these knowledges to our people? How do we empower our people, and so on.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And what are your organizational affiliations?
Yeah, right now I'm the president of the Midwest region of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. In fact, we just had our annual conference just 2 weeks ago, I believe. I'm the education chair of the Kemetic Institute of Chicago. This is an organization of which Dr. Jacob H. Carruthers, who you mentioned earlier, was one of the founders. Right now, those are really the two main things that I'm doing. In the past, I've been affiliated with the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Our rites of passage program in Chicago is Akobin Rites of Passage Society. I was a member of the New African, going way back, the New African Independence Movement. Really a study, RNA, Republican New Africa Study Group here in Chicago, and a number of organizations over the years.
I send a shout out to the All African People's Revolutionary Party. They, like when you look at people's Pan-African history, they tend to pop up. Yeah, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, for
reality to us. You know what I'm saying? For good reason. Yeah. And so as we say that, let's also call on the ancestor Baba Kwame Ture. I'm saying for doing that good work and making that organization a resource for many Africanists in our journey, whether we joined or not, whether we agreed with scientific socialism or not. They're just indispensable, to a lot of our growth. So yeah, we give thanks for that. All right. So now we're here to talk about this topic called martial arts, and we're gonna question that terminology a little bit later on. Yeah, but for now, yeah, let's continue to use it. Yeah, but just give our viewers an idea of your personal journey into martial arts. I know that you are not like you studied a number, right, of different martial arts. Yeah. So let's just get into how did you come to this martial arts journey?
Yeah, I was born in the mid 1970s, and so for a lot of people who were born, a lot of black men who were born in that era, I was greatly impacted by Kung Fu cinema. And so when I was younger, I remember being over my aunt's apartment watching Kung Fu movies, and I remember afterwards me and my cousins getting up and Kung Fu fighting with each other, right? So I remember really throughout the 1980s.
I got to ask you, how much things did you break in the process? How many windows, how many plates, how many good statues of your auntie did you mash up in the
exactly? Hopefully very little. But and it's interesting because the boys have a tendency to play fight. So you can only imagine what this idea of Kung Fu does to this idea, the practice of play fighting, right? So unfortunately, though, throughout most of my childhood, wasn't able to study the martial arts. So I went through, the 80s and really wanting to study martial arts. And this is, I grew up in the 80s and 90s in Chicago, and it was, in a lot of ways, a rough environment. I found myself in a lot of rough situations where martial knowledge would have been very useful. I shouldn't say I was bereft of knowledge, right? Because one of the things that was useful is my stepfather and I would box and wrestle with each other. And I don't think he had any formal training. I think he possessed what many people tend to possess. That is, they possess folk, sort of the folk martial knowledge it gets enacted in Black communities. Like in the United States, one of the folk boxing traditions that's a part of the community is slap boxing. And I never learned how to slap box, but that was a part of the martial culture that surrounded me, and so my stepfather, he and I would box and wrestle. And like I said, I don't think he had any training, but to be sure, it seemed like it was in the milieu of a sort of folk body of knowledge. So it really wasn't until I got to college, and because I had this yearning to study the martial arts all the way back, to my childhood, going back to at least when I was very young in the early 80s, I wasted no time and started training. I found a club on campus. There were a number of martial arts clubs that were at the university that I went to, and as soon as I got there, I started training right away. And so I trained initially in an eclectic art called Goshinjutsu. And basically it was an art that was a mix of boxing and Greco-Roman or freestyle wrestling, jiu-jitsu, aikido, karate. It was, really a hodgepodge of things. But it was a good foundation for me because there was a great emphasis in the style on functionality, on practicality. And that was very valuable to me. While I was studying that art, a friend of mine told me about this Afro-Brazilian martial art called capoeira, and if I remember correctly, he did the Ginga, and I think he may have done a couple of other movements. And I was looking at him, I'm like, that looks like a dance. That doesn't look like a martial art, but I remember he referred me to this film called Only the Strong. So I went out and rented the movie. That's when you had rental, video stores. You go out and rent movies.
Yes.
A long time ago. So I went out and rented the movie and watched it. It wasn't the best movie. But there were elements that intrigued me, specifically this art, right? And I should say it planted a seed. That seed really didn't germinate until another 2 or 3 years once I had graduated from college. I was back in Chicago, and I became curious about this thing, capoeira, mainly because I was interested in a Black martial art. In my youth, going all the way back to my teenage years, I was someone who certainly in my teenage years, I think I was Black-minded, and reading the autobiography of Malcolm X was, what catalyzed my consciousness, and that was really the spark that led me down the path towards Pan-African nationalism. I continued on that journey into my adulthood, and I got to this point at the end of the 1990s. I'm in my early to mid 20s, and I'm becoming increasingly curious about this. Because it seems fascinating to me, like a Black martial art, right? And beyond that, the historical and philosophical import of such a thing, right? A Black martial art. Try as I might, I could only find one capoeira class that was accessible to me. Chicago's, I don't know much your viewers know about the geography of Chicago, but I lived at the time on the south side of Chicago. I think there was probably capoeira on the north side, but if you live in Chicago, you don't want to be going from the south side to the north side. Like,
yes.
It's far, it's traffic, long train rides, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I did find a class on the south side, but it was on a day they had class on a day that I worked, so I could never make it. And so I ended up, continuing my martial arts studies. I started studying a Chinese martial art called Wing Chun. For people who've seen the Yip Man movies, I studied that art. And when I went back to college I got my master's degree when I was in Chicago, and then went away to school back to the university where I got my undergrad from to get my PhD. And while I was there, again, continued my martial arts studies, studied Kendo, studied another Chinese martial art called Chole Foot. But right around 2000, and I should say throughout that whole time, right, when I wasn't able to access that capoeira class, I didn't just throw away the idea. The seed of capoeira had been planted in my mind, right, and so I continued to explore, right, or at least to learn as much as I could. And so when I went to undergrad, right around that time, this is way back in the day of Yahoo groups, and so there were all these different discussion groups. Not many, but there were a few message boards or discussion boards, as well as a couple of Yahoo groups focused on the African martial arts. And I remember, my initial entry into these spaces was to get information, and I reached a point right around the middle of the 2000s. I want to say it was about 2004, where I was like, well, I've been wanting to do this since the end of the 90s. I really need to act very decisively to do this now, and it made me that I make some sacrifices. And so I reached out. I went out. I ordered this 2-volume VHS cassette set, World of African Martial Arts, featuring Gahati Kalindiyi. And Gahati Kalindiyi is an ancestor now.
Yes.
And I watched the videos. It was interesting to me, so I reached out to him. He was actually in one of these Yahoo groups that I was in. So I wrote to him, inquired about training. He told me that he has a camp that he did every year in June. So in June of 2006, 2005. So June 2005, I got in my car and drove all the way up to, it was somewhere, I think it was in northern Michigan. I mean, it was like 6-7 hours away. It was really far. Right. And it was at that camp that, I got, learned some of the stick fighting art. One of his stick fighting arts, he called Nabut. It's a stick fighting art from ancient Kemet. And also met another person, Mestre Pertuvelo, also known as Dennis Newsom, who is a capoeira teacher, is a master of capoeira. He also knows African-American folk boxing art called Jailhouse Rock. Some people consider it synonymous with 52 blocks, as well as a number of other martial arts, a number of African martial arts. And that encounter would be pivotal, because that, to me, was the thing that it was at that point that I felt like I was definitively on the path and decided to really devote my training over the next several years primarily to the African arts. Now, the problem with all this is that though my interest and determination was great, I really didn't have a whole lot of good access to information. One of the challenges with, and I can say more about this later on, but one of the challenges with African martial arts in the United States, and I would argue this is not radically dissimilar elsewhere, but I'll say that I'll give some, but with some exceptions, because there's some places where this is less of an issue, and I can perhaps elaborate on what I mean by that. But generally in the United States, the most readily available African, and I'm going to use African Afro-diaspora. I'm going to use African as synonymous for both things that are continental African as well as African diasporan for folks who may be.
Yes, sir.
So the most readily available African martial art is capoeira, right? To a lesser extent, there are other traditions that one may happen upon, such as 52 blocks in African boxing art, or even less likely various Afro-diasporan stick fighting traditions. But by and large, capoeira is the most accessible African martial art in the United States. And unfortunately, in many instances, a lot of people don't teach it as a martial art, which is a key challenge. And so I found myself both wanting to study capoeira, but also wanting to learn it as a martial art. So my initial foray, because I went to that camp, it really lit this spark. I found myself not too long after that living in St. Louis, Missouri, hooked up with a brother named Taboho, who was my first capoeira teacher. So I got my taste of capoeira from Mestre Pedrovelo at this camp in Michigan, but then I started studying capoeira with this brother named Taboho, and that was great because the brother really gave me a technical vocabulary to work from. He really taught me the game, the foundations of the game of capoeira, and that's a foundation that I still stand on.
Okay.
And really moved back to Chicago a few years later, but for the most part, for most of the 2010s, really didn't progress, I think, a whole lot, just in terms of my study of many of those other arts. I studied with a few capoeira teachers, so I think my understanding of capoeira grew incrementally, but something important did happen in that period. Right around 2011, 2012, I started teaching capoeira, and it was happenstance. I didn't set out to teach capoeira. I didn't necessarily, I don't think I would have even put myself out there as a capoeira teacher, but I was at we were at one of our homeschool groups.
Right.
And there was a little boy there who saw me doing capoeira out on the playground because my children were playing. And so, I try to multitask, especially when I was younger, right? They're playing on the playground. I'm going to do martial arts. So they're playing. I'm doing capoeira. But this one boy in the group saw capoeira. He saw me doing it. And he went to his mother, was like, "Hey, could you ask him if he'll teach that?" And she came to me and asked me. And I was like, I'm not a capoeira teacher, but I teach you what I know. And what I found is that once I started teaching it, people kept asking me to teach it. So I taught it a few times at African Liberation Day. I think I taught it at was a Kwanzaa event. So I found myself continually teaching capoeira, and it was as I began to embrace this identity of being or perhaps becoming a capoeira teacher, that it also impressed upon me the need for me to deepen my own study, to go deeper in the art.
Right.
And it was around that time. There's a couple of things happened. I made contact with Dr. Edward Poe, who's a really important person. Dr. Poe, as far as we can tell, was the first person to teach capoeira in the United States. He studied with Mr. Passinha in the late 1960s. Mr. Passinha is a very famous master of capoeira Angola. And Dr. Poe returned to the United States and started teaching capoeira Angola in Washington State in the early 1970s. And I, interacted with him, learned a bit from him, and then in 2017 began to study with Mr. Pedrovelo, who was the first mestre I got a lesson from way back in 2005. And so I've been studying with him and working with him since 2017, and it's been richly edifying, and it's greatly augmented, like my understanding of capoeira, as both a fighting art, but also as a holistic vehicle that is a vehicle for re-Africanization, right? And along the way, like one of the things that was a curious, I don't know how to say this, but something that was a sort of a curious development, that the pandemic ended up being a great boon for me personally in terms of martial knowledge. It was, and I think it's because everything was online, and so there were things that I'd been wanting to learn forever, like 52 blocks. I wanted to learn 52 blocks since 2000, and picked up a little bit here and there from a person here, a person there, but really wasn't able to take a deep dive. And it was during that period that I made contact with Professor Mo, who's the founder of the 52 Blocks Federation. I was able to learn a great deal more about the art from him, but also picked up some things from some other teachers as well. A good friend of mine, Damon Stith, he's a really a big exponent of the African fighting arts, and from him I picked up a little bit of esgrima de machete, which is an Afro-Colombian stick and blade fighting art, as well as a few other things that I learned from him, and also connected with a man named Maestro Maikiano, who is a teacher and a practitioner of Coco Ballet, Afro-Puerto Rican stick fighting art, Kalinda, which is again it's a stick fighting art we find throughout the diaspora, but he teaches a version of it that comes from Cuba, as well as Mani, and I've been able to learn some Mani and Coco Ballet, not Mani, I'm sorry, a little bit of Mani, but some Coco Ballet and Kalinda from him. And so really the last 3 or 4 years have been very rich for me in terms of greatly increasing the breadth of my own study. And me opportunities to further understand the various ways in which African people have sustained these traditions, and the various ways that these traditions are really deeply meaningful in terms of how we understand ourselves in the world, how we express ourselves, how we connect, how we build bridges to our ancestors, and also how these arts become anchors of African identity.
Beautiful. So it's that, you come back to kung fu theater, yeah, you're literally the guy who walks around the land, yeah, you know, looking for all the masters. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
You know,
But seriously, yeah.
you know? So I'm nearly gonna ask you if you have a father to avenge.
Right.
Sorry about the place, you
That
know
will
what I mean?
complete the circle,
Yeah,
exactly.
you know what I'm saying, you know. So technically, we're all avenging our fathers if
Exactly,
we
we
give
sure are.
the spirit of the irritated genie, as Baba Jenny
Right.
Shemchu taught us, right?
Right,
You know what I'm saying? Vindication of our ancestors, right?
exactly.
So we give thanks for that, yeah. Now for each of the systems that you've just mentioned, there's a history there, and we don't have time to go into the history of all of them. Yeah. And I was tempted to look at a history of capoeira, but I think most people understand that capoeira comes from Central Africa with Africans and is basically preserved mostly in Brazil. Yeah. What I will ask you though is that is that conventional history or oversimplification? And is it just Brazil? Will we find it elsewhere? Do you know what I'm saying? Because there are some people that would say that it's a Brazilian martial art, right?
Yes.
It just I'm saying. So we understand that trajectory, but to what extent is the overemphasis on Brazil true to the history and the cultural evolution, or an oversimplification of it?
That's a beautiful question. It takes me back to a presentation that I just gave at the ASCAC Midwest Region at the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations ASCAC Midwest Region Conference about what I was attempting to do was to offer a theory about the history of 52 blocks. Capoeira is interesting. Capoeira is an interesting art in terms of the type of historiography that surrounds it, because what practitioners tend to do is they draw a straight line from capoeira from Angola to Brazil, right? And you see this even in some of the stories of some of the famous masters of capoeira. Mestre Pastinha said that, he says that his teacher was an African. I believe Mestre Bimba, another famous capoeira master of the early 20th century, I believe also says that his teacher was an African. So we find the story a lot of these mid and early 20th century masters of capoeira will say that their teachers were Africans, right? Oftentimes very specifically Angolans. And so capoeira, we have this sort of folk history that makes a very direct connection to Angola, right? To Brazil. But for many of the Afro-diasporan traditions, that line isn't as straight. If anything, we have to understand that these are, let's say, these are traditions which emerge out of a confluence of what I would call African martial cultures. And so what I did in this presentation that I gave, because 52 blocks is not something we can draw a straight line. Like we can draw a line to Africa and to the U.S., but we can't draw a line from Angola to the U.S. or from Nigeria to the U.S., right? It's a little more, I think I maintain it's a little more complicated than that. So what I attempted to do in the presentation is to make the point that if we look at the Africans who were brought to the United States, and we look at the martial cultures that were active in the places where they were taken, whether those places were on the continent itself or whether those places were in the diaspora, that then gives us a way of understanding the formation of more localized or regional martial cultures in the United States. And so with regards to capoeira, to a large extent, I think that argument right there, that is the connection to Angola, I think is probably a reasonable one in a lot of ways. But I think that when we look at, I think we also have to attend to the fact that what becomes capoeira in Brazil becomes El Juego de Mani in Cuba, it becomes Danmie or Lagia in Martinique, it becomes knocking and kicking in the United States. You know what I'm saying? It has offshoots in Jamaica. I've heard of it having derivatives in Colombia. Essentially what the Africans that were taken from the Congo-Angola region essentially laid the seed for the formation of a martial culture that contained invariably things, elements that are present in capoeira. Those elements being, if we were to take probably the most salient, the use of evasive techniques to avoid the use of evasion rather than blocking as a primary means of defense, as well as use of inverted kicks, as well as, in addition to the use of inverted kicks, the use of the head as a weapon, the use of headbutts. And we find that the expressions of that martial culture throughout the diaspora. You know what I'm saying? In some cases, we find parts of that. In some cases, we find it very holistically. And so with Cuba, with Danmie and Martinique, in Jamaica, the United States, in Brazil. You all find those common elements: evasions, the use of inverted kicks, kicking where you're upside down, the use of head as a weapon. And so, indeed, I think it's reasonable sort of folk genealogy that exists that whereby we connect capoeira with Angola. But I think we also have to be mindful of the fact that those same ancestors or those same martial cultures that laid the foundation for capoeira in Brazil also in their full flowering produced related traditions elsewhere. And those related traditions, however, in their own sort of domestic or regional milieux, often were also inflected or also were impacted by other African martial cultures. So, for instance, if you look at Damier in Martinique, it has a couple of features that you don't necessarily see in capoeira, such as striking with the fist. There are some fist strikes in capoeira, but not so much. But Damier also has grappling. There's some takedowns in capoeira, but I would hesitate to call it grappling, right? Martinique has that as well. Where you have, a variety of strikes that are not present, at least in no lineage of capoeira that I'm aware of, as well as a grappling technique. And so what appears to have happened is that in the process of those Africans refining methods whereby they could defend themselves, and the role of martial arts among captive Africans were multiple, right? But personal and group or communal defense was one of them. There were other functions, but what is clear is that these tools were refined, right? And in some places, that refinement necessarily entailed the incorporation of other, related or compatible, I should say, martial traditions. So many of these arts, they tend to be composites. To have elements from varying martial cultures that congealed into their existing forms in whatever place. But the last thing I'll say is this, I think also with regards to capoeira, it is important to understand that even within Brazil, there are different traditions of capoeira. Go back to the 19th century, you tend to find historical accounts that posit capoeira in three key places: Bahia, Pernambuco, and Rio de Janeiro. And so my lineage, I've done capoeira. In fact, most of the time that I've been in capoeira, I've done varying styles that have their root in Bahia. But since I've hooked up with Mestre Pedro Velho, our style of capoeira comes from Rio de Janeiro. And when you read many of the accounts of the harshest persecution of capoeira or the use of capoeira against the authorities, many of those accounts come from Rio. And so in Rio, there existed a very martial tradition of capoeira. So even capoeira in Brazil is not sort of unitary. That is, that there are variations of it, that there are lineages of it that also have unique expressions and as well as unique genealogies.
All right. So I became inspired by capoeira quite young, and mostly not through direct capoeira itself. There was a group over here when I was a child that had developed a thing called Kazimba. It's a Kikonga terminology, and they're also referred to as Kazimba and Ngoma, which is very similar, to capoeira. My uncle used to do it when I was young, and I always wanted to go, but it was in South London, and I lived in East, so it wasn't possible, right? And then capoeira I wanted to do, but there was a point where you could find it everywhere, but it's severely colonized, and I just like I could do, because I used to do taekwondo as a child. I could do taekwondo with anybody. I couldn't do taekwondo with just anybody, right? It just didn't feel right, and I might be more liberal today than I was then for different reasons, but at that point I was like, I can't bring myself to engage, right? With just a sea full of Europeans in what I consider to be an African martial art. And then there's been a few others, but then there was a film called Bloodsport, and there's a scene in there in this kumite, the tournament, whereby they have a capoeira fighter fighting, I believe it's a taekwondo fighter, and like they had him win, right, in this particular aspect of the fight, but there's this move that he did that just totally, I was like, oh my days, right? What he did, right? I'll do my best. I would play it for you if I wasn't sure I wasn't gonna get a strike, but basically, he kicks him down a couple of times, but then he dances towards him, turns his back, but then sticks out his leg and trips him while not even looking at him. Yeah,
Wow.
right. Just
Wow.
trips him up. I was like, that was because nobody. I was like, the first time I saw it, I didn't realize what he did. I had to rewind the video. Yes, VHS. Yeah, video. Right. You know what I'm saying? To catch it. So I was like, yeah, I love that. But I got the principle, and my uncle who was doing Kazimba, taught about evasion and deception. And also maintaining your momentum, so that you can use the momentum of your opponent against them, but you have to keep moving, all right, and that kind of thing. So there are all those principles, that you learn from this particular martial art. We're going to come back to that properly in a second, but you've mentioned 52 blocks a number of times, and I believe that many people also known or as associated with it. Well, first of all, in your answer to this question, you can actually address whether 52 blocks and Jailhouse Rock. Well, I was hearing a slight echo there, but it's gone.
Yeah,
okay.
something happened, but I can still hear you.
Okay, cool. So yeah, in your answer to this question, you can address whether 52 blocks and Jailhouse Rock is the same thing or something or something different, right? But I'm sure many people wouldn't know what 52 blocks is. So please just give our viewers an understanding of 52 blocks and what that is.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so 52 blocks is I call it an African American folk boxing tradition. So just to be clear, when we talk about a folk tradition, we're talking about traditions that exist within the milieu, within the context, the domain of community, right?
Yes.
Taekwondo is not a folk martial tradition, not at this point. You know what I'm saying? Certainly.
Right.
But if we were to go to really any place in the world, and we found a little martial art that exists in this community among those people, you can't go to a school to learn it. There are no books about it. That would be a folk martial tradition, right? And they exist, at one point in time, they existed all over the world. Globalization and migration has had a big impact in terms of diminishing the salience of such traditions. But I would argue folk 52 blocks is really a folk martial tradition to a large extent. But that's shifting. It's shifting. So with regard, there are folk boxing traditions throughout the African American community, right? I already mentioned one of them before, slap boxing. Which when I was a young man, I would see other young men slap box with each other. As I've talked to other people, I found that people in different parts of the country, they slap box, but they had different rules for how they slap box versus how people slap boxed in Chicago when I was a teenager. Another folk boxing tradition that I knew and participated in as a teenager was body punching. This is where it's a pugilistic game where you strike one another's torso, and whoever can't take the pain, and they surrender, they lose, right? I've spoke to people who are older than me, also from Chicago, who they describe that same game but differently. Again, these are martial games. There are other, so there are different folk boxing traditions in the community. Because they are folk traditions, that is, because they are often localized in their expression, they tend to vary from place to place in terms of what they're called, in terms of how they are enacted, right? How they're transmitted is often the same. That is, from person to person. There's no school. Like, you couldn't go back to, let's say, if we could jump in a time machine and go back to the 1950s in the United States, we couldn't go to any Black community in the United States and learn the predecessor of 52 blocks or Jaws. There's no school that we could learn these things. We would have to simply be a part of the community and learn them from people in the community in the course of daily life, and more than likely as young men in the process of growing up. You're right. So the point is that I would say 52 blocks is what the term that people give to a particular formation of that folk boxing tradition that's associated with New York, right? That's characterized by the use of what Diallo Frazier calls offensive defense. That is, someone attacks, you block the attack, but you attack the attack at the same time, as well as what I call them multi-stage blocks. That is, people will engage in these motions that are designed to block a flurry of punches, not just one punch, but a flurry of punches. So it's not, you don't just do one thing because that's to block one punch, but you do a series of things that are intended to block multiple punches, as well as the principle of economy of motion, changing levels, and what I would say the weaponization of the body, right? Using the whole body as a weapon. The Jailhouse Rock, interesting, because Jailhouse Rock is that term, even though many people, like I think I mentioned this earlier, like they'll use it synonymously with 52 blocks, and I do think there's a great deal of they are enmeshed to a degree. But I've also encountered people for whom the term jailhouse rock just refers to a folk boxing tradition in their locality that doesn't necessarily contain all of the aforementioned principles, right? You know, so there's a brother that I know in Chicago. He said when he was younger, when he was in the streets, you know, they would refer to that style of street fighting as jailhouse rock. You know, I'm not aware of it containing the use of offensive in the way sort of like what people call skull and crossbones. Somebody punch and I block and I try to hit their hand with my elbow while I parry. You know, their boxing didn't contain that. It would contain things like changing levels. That is, being able to hit from head to toe. Economy of motion, whereas I hit and I flow into an elbow. The weaponization of the body, where I use my hands, I use my elbows, I use my shoulders, I use my head, I use whatever I have, right? And so for people that I've encountered who talk about jailhouse rock, it seems that that element, or that expression of the art in its singularity certainly contained the elements that I just mentioned, and may, depending on the practitioner, may or may not have contained, you know, these offensive defenses like skull and crossbones or cover the bullet or elbow tap. People, or the AL people have different names for it. And then of course, in many instances, the way that because these are, you know, I guess one has to understand that these are also martial traditions that are not codified. And when I say codified, the codification of a martial art is when that martial art is organized, right?
Yes.
If memory serves me correctly, I think Taekwondo was codified like somewhere in the early 20th century, right? Wing Chun, I think most people attribute the codification of Wing Chun largely to Yip Man in his time in Hong Kong in the 1960s and 70s. I could be wrong, but that's the impression that I give from the way people talk, because it doesn't seem like they refer to that happening in southern China on the mainland. The codification of capoeira in Bahia happens really begins in the 20s, but really happens in the 30s and 40s in Bahia. In Rio, it seems like it happens in the 1970s. So codification is where you organize a martial art. Well, these arts, these African American folk boxing arts, as far as I could tell, really aren't, you know, I think people are codifying them right now. So you go on YouTube and you see all these people talking about 52 blocks. Some of them have students, some of them have groups, some of them have organizations. And it's clear to me, at least since the late 2000s, there's been an increased effort by some of these individuals to codify that. But what should be noted is that there are other expressions of the folk boxing traditions that exist in other parts of the Black community that have never undergone that. For instance, there's an article on the Black Foundation website. So if anybody's interested in looking this up, it's blacfoundation.org about a art called CP. CP is an acronym for Central Prison. It's a penal institution in North Carolina. And the author of that article, Eddie Falk, talks about a folk boxing art in that prison. And you read it, it sounds a lot like 52 Blocks, right? In fact, there's a video on the site, that same site, of him doing an art. He calls it, I forget, like foot tripping, boxing and foot tripping or something like that. But you see him using, you know, some boxing strikes and foot sweeps, right? Again, this is another folk. This is not 52 Blocks. This is not jailhouse rock. This is whatever the folk boxing tradition of his locality is. I remember my last conversation with the Hadi Kalindi, we were in Brooklyn. This is in 2019. And he told me about a folk boxing tradition associated with, I think it was Jackson State Prison in Michigan. And he said it was a style of boxing called jacking. And he said it was very much like 52 Blocks, you know, with the sort of offensive defense, the weaponization of the body, and so on. So the point is that the Black community appears to be awash, or at least historically was awash with these various fighting traditions. However, given some of the social changes that have occurred in the community since the 1990s, I'm not sure how vibrant, you know, I'm not sure of the vitality of these traditions. This is an issue that faces not just these, but I would argue faces African martial cultures
in general.
Yeah.
Powerful point. I've done a few deep dives into Kalinda, particularly as it exists. And for those who are not aware, Kalinda is a stick fighting martial art that, as brother Kamau has said, exists throughout the diaspora. But there are some brothers in Trinidad who have done a lot to kind of evolve. I don't know if you come across them. I wouldn't say their names, but their names are going up my head right now.
I met Master Rondell Benjamin and was able to
Right. So and done a lot of work, not just in terms of the physicality of it, but the culture, the spirituality of it, the musicality of it as well, which is, as a music man, that's you know what I'm saying, right? But then I've also read Julie Dash as a teenager, or maybe in my early 20s, Daughters of the Dust. And she speaks about Kalinda among the Gullah Geechee in the Carolinas there as well. And I know from an elder that used to teach here in London that it also existed in Barbados, but has referred to it as a martial form, distinct from a martial art. And similar to what you're saying in terms of it being a folk tradition, so there's no codified, way you're gonna learn this. You just have to be among the man them, and that's how you get involved, right? And then going beyond that, I would say that because of there is a significant, because of the extent to which capoeira has grown, there is a certain level of codification there. But then you have other traditions. So as well as Kalinda, but even if you go back to the continent, there is wrestling, that exists in many different cultures, wrestling forms, right? And then there's this one hand boxing thing, that you find out, I think mostly in West Africa, Senegal, and place, but they're not often considered in the realms of martial arts. They're activities and sports, that sorry, parenting never stops, my brother. You know what I'm saying?
I know that lifestyle very well.
You know what I'm saying? So I want to ask you about then that process, because okay, just as a parallel here. So as you know, I teach what is referred to as yoga, and then when you study then the same thing happens. People think that this thing was it was codified thousands of years ago, and I've been doing these things from 2200 BC, and it's, what I'm saying, right? When you check it, like really and truly is the last 100 years that really and truly the thing was really codified, right? You know what I'm saying? So I say that to say that because of there's other cultures have been granted a level of sophistication that ours have not, principally really because of interruptions in our cultural and creative production that have not allowed us to develop in certain ways, all right? And so we feel like we always have to step out of in order to grow, in order to develop. We don't feel like that there are things that we have that we just need to develop on. Just you see what I'm saying, right? So I want to get your perspective on that. It's a very broad question, but in relation to the evolution of African martial arts, all the ones that you know about, so even all the ones that I've just mentioned, and I'm going to come back to the wrestling in a second because it relates to another question. But what is your thoughts on that evolution? Where do you see it going? Is it a conscious thing? Is it happening naturally, or are we losing those traditions because now we've got Wing Chun in Nigeria, or you know what I'm saying, or wherever? Go ahead.
Yeah, really appreciate that. That's a wonderful question. I'm gonna say I'm first start off saying yes to all of that, right? So this is, so I want to go back to something I mentioned earlier, right? So I said in the United States, if you want to learn African martial arts, capoeira is going to be your go-to because that's going to be the easiest thing to get, and it's because it was codified. Is their organizations, is their mechanisms of dissemination. If you want to learn it, we can get on a plane and I can give you the names of multiple teachers that you can go to study with in Bahia and Rio, right? It's got, capoeira has been organized to that extent. That's not true of all arts, but what happened in the mid-20th century in many parts of the African world, many of these martial traditions became endangered. And as a result, in some places there were very concerted efforts to ensure their survival. From what I understand, this happened in Trinidad, and so there was great effort to ensure the survival of Kalinda. And Martinique, Dan Mier faced a number of challenges, and so people came together. There was a group that was formed, AM4, which was one of the key organizations to ensure the survival of Dan Mier in that island. And I think what people did is, I think to a certain extent, maybe people learned from the example of capoeira,
right?
That if you want, in fact, even in Réunion in the Indian Ocean, their tradition Moringue, I believe it's called, is very capoeira like. It's almost looks like a hybrid between capoeira and Moringue boxing from Madagascar. I think they also faced a similar issue in the mid-20th century. And I think a lot of these people took inspiration from capoeira, because in fact I'll even see some of these groups from different parts of the world who aren't capoeira, but they'll dress like capoeiristas. You know what I'm saying? Which is kind of interesting to me. You know, sort of they adopted the garb of the capoeira practitioner. So I think some people have looked at capoeira and they're attempting to learn from capoeira as a model. In fact, there's a discourse has emerged among some 52 blocks practitioners, which intrigues me, where they'll refer to 52 as the black man's martial art. And I take that to mean they're referring to 52 blocks as really sort of this martial arts of African Americans. That is, that 52 blocks is to African Americans as capoeira is to Afro-Brazilians, right?
Yes.
And so I think what has happened, I think, as a consequence of people's efforts to ensure the survival of these traditions, is that they, in many instances, have attempted to engage very holistically with what these arts, what these traditions represent. And I'll try to give several examples of this. You mentioned Kalinda, and so I met Master Rondell Benjamin from Trinidad, who's a Kalinda stick fighter. And one of the things that was intriguing to me when about his teaching methodology, he started off with dancing, right?
Yes, yeah.
Movement was key. And I remember on this one day during this event, how powerful the music was. You know, I had just, in fact, it was an interesting day because this is the Afro Diaspora Stick and Blade gathering. It was in Los Angeles in February, and so there was Kalinda, Afro Trinidadian Kalinda, the African American Kalinda, Wagadi Mani from Cuba, and Esgrima de Machete from Colombia. And on that last day of the event, I had just did some of the Kalinda, the African American Kalinda, with 3 different people, and I was spent. You know, I was tired. Right. And then Master Rondell came up, and he's like, "Well, grab your sticks. It's time to do this again." And so so I'm up there, and I'm tired. My heart is pounding. I'm breathing heavy. And then they started playing on drums, and then we started dancing, and we started singing. And I felt like somebody, what is it in Dragon Ball, those senzu beans? Like somebody had just gave me a senzu bean. It was like magic. You know, you would think I was fresh, that nothing had happened. And it was amazing to me, because the only other art where I've seen that is capoeira, where you could be in the order, you could be playing capoeira, and the music takes you to places that you don't expect to go. You go in, you know what I'm saying? You start playing, and then the music, you start going fast, and you don't even realize that you're spent until it's all over. You're like, man, hard. I wasn't breathing hard. Or maybe you were, but you just didn't know it. And so the music enables you, and the holistic presentation, the holistic presentation of these arts often enables the practitioner to experience them on multiple levels of being. That is body, mind, and spirit, right? Yeah. And what I think has been a great boon, as people have both attempted to ensure the survival of these traditions, and in some cases revitalize these traditions, in many places there has been a fidelity towards a comprehensive transmission of these arts in their holistic beauty. So that is, some of these traditions maintain both martial as well as folkloric traditions. That is, martial traditions being things pertaining to fighting, folkloric meaning often the music, the dance, the song, and an increasing recognition of the import of these things in their totality. That is, oftentimes that folkloric part, the dance part, oftentimes gives little insights in terms of the nature of the fork. Oftentimes the music is important for the imparting of particular psychological and spiritual states of being. So these things are complementary, they're holistic, and it really speaks to the genius of the way in which our ancestors conceptualized martial practice, because you see the same thing in traditions on the continent, right? And so, I mean, in many instances, these traditions are endangered. What I've seen is that in the diaspora, in the places where people have attempted to organize these traditions to ensure their survival, to ensure their propagation, you know, through oftentimes institutions, cultural institutions, as in, you know, in Trinidad and Colombia, and of course Brazil, and you know, and Martinique, and so on, these traditions survive, right? And this is what people, I think, are trying to do right now. At least Professor Moore is attempting to do this with 52 blocks in the United States. On the continent, I think we see a similar thing happening. But one of the things that you see happening on the continent, which is intriguing to me, like in places like Senegal and in Nigeria, of course, in Senegal, you know, lamb or wrestling is the national sport. We're talking about a tradition that's already institutionalized, a tradition that's not going anywhere, right? Yes. In Nigeria, I think I discovered like some years ago, there was a formation that had been established, maybe more than one, to promote traditional sports, traditional forms of wrestling, traditional forms of boxing, and so on. And so you see this in different parts of the continent. In other places, like in South Africa, there's a great deal of organization and institutionalization around the various forms of stick fighting, whether it's Zulu or Xhosa stick fighting in Southern Africa, and so, you know, and so on. So I think in the places where people have been very intentional about their organization, those arts are thriving, and in some cases thriving. But what has to be pointed out here, this goes back to something that I've experienced personally, right? So I've been teaching capoeira since the early 2010s, and it's capoeira is popular, but it's not popular to the point, at least in the African community, where one can promote capoeira without also simultaneously having to explain to people what capoeira is.
Right.
I often find myself both explaining what capoeira is to people while also attempting to interest them in the art itself, right? And so one of the things that is that's been interesting to me, just in terms of observing that, is that I'm far more likely to see people, even people that I know, you know, where they'll have their kids doing karate and doing taekwondo, and judo. And I remember for a while I was just scratching my head like, well, y'all know I teach capoeira, and y'all know it's black, you know. And I remember one day I was talking to Dr. Edward Poe, and he explained to me, he's like, well, Kamau, you have to understand that there's a great deal of institutional incentive in the study of Asian martial arts. And I was like, what do you mean, Dr. Poe? He says, well, if you study judo, you can go to judo competitions, you can get medals. Judo's in the Olympics, you know. With taekwondo, right? You can go to competitions, you can get medals and trophies. You can also go to the Olympics. You understand what I'm saying? And we don't have those kind of institutional mechanisms built around our traditions. I'm not saying we should have that. So I'm not necessarily advocating that. My position is that we as African people should be engaged in the practice of our cultural traditions, if for no other reason than the fact that they are ours. But most especially because they are anchors of a particular type of consciousness, a consciousness that I would argue is fundamental to informing our capacity to transform reality, right? So I consider them very powerful tools, very effective tools, not only in terms of the disciplining of the body, but also in terms of the transformation of the mind as a precondition to transforming reality. So I'm not saying that we need medals and trophies. You know, I'm not advocating that. But I do think that if we were to make the argument that there's a type of diminishment of the salience, the visibility, the integrity of these traditions among Black people, I don't believe that an honest assessment can explain that without also having to acknowledge just simply the impact of non-African martial arts in African spaces. The last thing I'll say about that is this. I appreciate that you mentioned like Wing Chun in Nigeria. I think you said that. On Facebook and maybe YouTube, but certainly on Facebook, I've seen a number of brothers, Nigerian cats, promoting and practicing Wing Chun. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm not making any, because it's a martial art. You should learn, self-protection is a necessary element of human survival. You should learn whatever martial tools you have available to you, right? If, however, alongside that endeavor, you're able to learn, one's own tradition and to promote that tradition and refine that tradition, right? And expand that tradition, I think that's also exceedingly valuable. And I would argue that in some instances, though perhaps not all, but I would argue in some instances, the proportionality or the visibility of Asian martial arts in some of our communities is in direct proportion to the extent to which we have lost a connection to our own ancestral martial traditions,
Well, I'm gonna emphasize that with the fact that we're not just seeing like Wing Chun as a martial art, but we're seeing Shaolin temples.
Indeed,
right?
Yeah,
which is another level of things, along with Confucius institutes and so on. And so we have to be mindful of these things, which kind of brings me to a broader question, but similar one. So like I'm a guy, I have like yourself, I have various different interests, and so I would do a deep dive every now and then, even if it's just a video one on a particular topic. And so it became apparent to me. I'm not an avid viewer of UFC. Ultimate Fighting Championships, MMA, mixed martial arts, right? But I do check in every now and then, but more on the development of it as a sport, right? Especially because it's often compared to boxing, and so on, right? And then you come across now the impact that mixed martial arts, MMA, has had on the martial arts world, to the point whereby there is now 2 or 3 categories. You've got combat martial arts, you've got traditional martial arts, and then for some, in between combat and traditional, you've got something called self-defense. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. So to explain this for viewers who may not be completely au fait with the thing, yeah, the idea is that the UFC has revealed the extent to which, revealed which martial arts work in actual combat and which don't, with the prevailing view, generally speaking, that most, if not all, traditional martial arts really fail, yeah, in this regard, with the exception of a few, which I'll name in a second, right? And that, so therefore, in order, if you're looking to fight like combat wise, there are basically a few arts that you really need to learn, and then those combat arts may not necessarily be applicable in the realm of self-defense, because the aim of self-defense is essentially not getting hurt, yeah, and being able to escape a situation, not confronting your enemy, right, so to speak, yeah. And then within that context, because it used to be the case, like maybe a decade or two ago, that capoeiristas used to feel disrespected by the kung fu, the taekwondo, the karate, yeah, as ineffective in comparison to those. Where it looks like now UFC has made everything look ineffective, yeah. Right, that's cool, yeah. Right, so I know man that was dealing with Aikido, and them that shit where, yeah, because they learn Brazilian jiu-jitsu.
That's right.
That's effective, right? You know what I'm saying? You know, because of its grappling elements, yeah, which is interesting because based upon the fact that arguably the most ubiquitous martial art, particularly in West Africa, is in fact wrestling, yeah. And so when it comes down to it, one of the things that I'm learning is that people consider traditional wrestling to be an effective combat art, yeah. But capoeira is not seen as high on that list. Yeah. So I want to know where you stand with that, because I've heard you speak about capoeira and the fact that when you train, and the brothers and sisters that you train with are very much interested in terms of its functionality as a fighting form, yeah. Whereas not all capoeiristas are particularly have that necessarily emphasis, yeah. And then within all the martial arts that I've mentioned just now, there are those like kung fu and aikido that are also trying to make it more functional. So they're trying to use whatever they've gotten from their tradition to make it more functional. But where do you stand on that whole debate in general and its application to capoeira in particular?
Yeah. I'll start with something that Hati Kalindi said to me in a conversation some years ago. I can't remember when this conversation happened. I think it may have been in the late 2000s. He said to me that traditionally martial artists, they didn't have time to like do their martial art, their self-defense over here, and their fitness over here, and their spirituality over there. It was really all encompassing, right?
Yes.
And I think like one of the things that we have to understand is that in many instances, traditional martial arts were holistic vehicles. They were holistic vehicles. They were embedded in the social fabric of the people that practiced them. And so, you wouldn't have had a dynamic, not only in traditional societies, I would argue you wouldn't have had a dynamic even 60 or 70 years ago, in many places, many parts of the world, where I have the luxury of like, I'm going to go train martial arts and then I'm going to train self-defense separately. I need that one thing to be a multifunction tool. I need to be a Swiss Army knife. You know what I'm saying? And I think that what has happened in the context with the advent of mixed martial arts, I think it's that sort of organization. I really appreciate the way you broke that down, right? You have these combat sports. I remember, these reality or self-defense based martial arts. Then you have traditional martial arts.
Yep.
In many ways, I would argue that it's a false separation. And the reason why I say it's a false separation is because, like, let's use, I don't know, maybe House of Boxing is an example. Dambe is an example. Dambe is that one-arm boxing. So people they block and parry with the lead hand, and they strike with the rear hand. And this was an art that traditionally was associated with the Butchers Guild. Right. So it was an art that was also associated with a very specific subset of people in society. I've heard of other instances where, some contexts where they would fight with wrist knives, so blades on the wrist. Right. Now, again, I think we have to be clear. we're talking about something that was a combat sport, a traditional combat sport. But once we start introducing bladed weapons, obviously we're talking about something that can be an instrument of war as well, right? If we take capoeira, for example, capoeira, there's this I would argue this fetishization of capoeira as a folkloric tradition, right? So people want to emphasize the dance-like aspects of it, the acrobatics of it, this is sort of the public presentation of it, which is very unfortunate. When you go back and read these accounts in the 19th century, I mean, these capoeiristas were fighting police, they were fighting the military. Like it wasn't like they didn't have this idea, capoeira is not for fighting. I actually read that in a book one day from a guy who taught capoeira. He said that if you're interested in self-defense, there are better martial arts to study. And it was mind-blowing to me. I'm like, how do we call it a martial art? These people all throughout the 18th and 19th century in Brazil were fighting with it. Like somebody should have told them it wasn't a martial art. They were confused. They didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know that wasn't for fighting. It was only for dancing and playing, right? What I think has happened in the modern context, as these arts are extricated, as these arts are removed from the social context that gave them life and meaning, they, as a consequence, become diminished in their expression, right? That traditionally, and I'll use like many of the stories like Dr. Poe, he and I will talk about his time in Brazil, because he experienced capoeira at a point, certainly before I was even born, but also at a different stage in capoeira's transformation. I don't want to say evolution because that implies different types of process, and I'm not sure that would be the best. And he told me a couple of things which were very interesting to me about his teacher, Mr. Pastinha's teaching methodology. One of the things that he said that was intriguing to me, he said that they would train for defending themselves against weapon attacks, particularly blades and guns, because people carry blades and guns, right? That he would say, for the most part, while he was there, they didn't wear uniforms to class. Now, if you go to my capoeira class, there's a uniform. But he said that Mr. Pastinha eschewed uniforms. He said uniforms are fine for demonstrations, but for class, he wanted people to wear what they normally wear so that they can practice in what they normally practice, so that when they have to defend themselves, they're in sort of, they're in clothing, they're in attire that's analogous to how they would normally be, that's analogous to how they would normally be, right? So if I'm wearing dress shoes all the time, but I'm training barefoot, there's going to be a disconnect. That stuff that I can do, the traction I can get when I'm barefoot is not going to be the same thing that's going to happen when I'm wearing dress shoes, right? So clearly, Mr. Pastinha, clearly had this understanding. This is a martial tradition. This is a fight. This art was an art of war. But also understood that the art, as a consequence, had to be practical. And so, and even though they did performances for tourists, even though they did, especially by the time you get to the late 1960s, they would take part in these folkloric presentations, there was never any confusion about the extent to which the art itself was this holistic martial tradition, those folkloric elements associated with it notwithstanding. The last thing I'll say, just to add on to that, right? You had an effort in Brazil beginning in the 1970s to create capoeira competitions. In fact, just last week, I was training with one of our contramestres, Contramestre Boja Cantador, who teaches in Dallas, Texas, with our group. My group is Usumalaji Mestre Toro under my teacher, Mestre Pedro. So I was there with Contramestre Boja Cantador. He showed me these videos of these capoeira competitions coming out of Brazil, and they were really interesting, right? And there's been this effort really for the last 50 years to develop capoeira into a combat sport.
Right.
And I've seen varying expressions of it, some which were better than others. This one was probably one of the better expressions of it that I've seen. But you have to be mindful. Whenever we make something a combat sport, we then say that there are things you can do and things you cannot do.
Can't do, right?
It's true of all combat sports, So I participated virtually in this workshop a year or two ago. Baba Balogun, who lives in Atlanta, Georgia, he had a champion Senegalese wrestler come to the U.S. And so the brother was doing a workshop. Again, I was on Zoom, and it was interesting because he went through all these techniques, and then he said, but when we're serious about fighting, we add other elements.
Right.
It was very revealing. You understand what I'm saying?
Right.
In capoeira, the way we teach capoeira, and probably in any capoeira group, there are a lot of things that you do in the game of capoeira when you're playing capoeira with the other person. But there are other things that you typically don't do in the game of capoeira because they're there for when it's real serious business. right?
Yeah.
For somebody to be hurt. And so often when I teach my students, there's a dichotomy. There's some techniques that are for the jogo, that is for the game, and some that are for the luta, that is the fight, right?
Okay.
And I think that this idea that you have combat sports and traditional martial arts, and then these self-defense arts, is based on a reductive understanding of what these martial arts were in the context in which they existed. Because again, I argue that traditionally, oftentimes these arts entailed all of that. And so by that, I mean this, and that is that they would have, in many contexts, people would develop ways of people engaging in playful exchanges of these traditions that were non-lethal, right? This is true certainly of the predecessor of capoeira Ngolo, as well as other various combat martial games that existed in the Congo Angola area. That there were aspects of, headbutting was one. There was a headbutting game that young boys would do. They get on all fours and butt heads with each other, right? And this was carried to the diaspora, right? I mean, Frederick Douglass would talk about how on Sundays on the plantations, among the various recreational pursuits of these enslaved Africans, headbutting was one of them, right? And there were different modalities of headbutting. Now, the thing is this: when you go back and you read T.J. Obi's book, Fighting for Honor, he argues that in the first half of the 19th century in Brazil, the capoeiristas, in fact, he says in the 19th century, the capoeiristas were the top assassins. But he says in the first half of the 19th century, they mainly killed with their heads. Now, again, think about that. You have a game that boys play with their butt heads with each other. You have Africans on plantations at that same time are playing with their butting heads. They're not killing each other, but they are butting heads. But you have other people that when it's time for serious business, they know how to use those headbutts to great effect. Mr. Pastinha said that the capoeirista, when confronted with danger, runs. He runs to avoid killing. This tells us that for all the talk of capoeira essentially being a folkloric tradition, that people who were in the know understood that the art could be very dangerous if properly. So I would argue that many of these traditional arts had an element which allowed for playful, non-lethal exchanges, sort of a sportive element. They had an element that was focused on self-protection, which were included things which were often eschewed from the playful exchange, the non-lethal sportive exchanges, as well as folkloric elements, which include music and drum and dance, which were important in terms of transmitting, for lack of the ashe, the culture, the essence. What will Mama Marimba say? The asili, right, of the art and the people whose humanity it speaks to. So it's really a false separation. And it's a false separation that I think is really born of the fact that, I mean, just to be honest, we're in a Western society, right? We're in a Western society that eschews, for instance, spiritual values. We're in a Western society that in many instances eschews, or that in many instances takes a utilitarian approach towards the appropriation of non-Western cultural tradition. And I think that has to be understood in terms of what we are seeing.
Yes, sir. Well, brother, that's a brilliant answer. And just to clarify for all those who are listening, in the dynamic that I just talked about, all of the traditional martial arts come under question. So we're including all forms of kung fu, karate, taekwondo, jiu-jitsu, whatever it is, boxing, what I'm saying, which is among those who promote this, is considered to be quite a functional one because of its striking ability. So I would say that for the most part, those that are considered to be effective are those where like boxing, Brazilian jiu-jitsu in particular, with the wrestling, the grappling, and traditional wrestling. Those three seem to get the accolade because they're more functional within the setting of UFC. But from what I understand, though, my brother, the key differential is not necessarily the preference is based upon the extent to which in the practice of the martial art you train against opponents who are resistant to what you're doing. So in the sense of the fact that when you look at a lot of traditional martial art demonstrations, a person is practicing a move on a willing participant, right? So you don't necessarily get to see how that move functions when somebody is not cooperating with the thing, right? You know what I'm saying, you know what I'm saying. So and interestingly, I don't know how, like, again, I've got one more question after this, and we're going to open up to the viewers here. But because of the fact that capoeira like, okay, different to like karate, for example, you got katas, yeah. All right, whereby it's a form. Yeah, taekwondo. I can still do certain taekwondo forms today, where you're going through certain moves in a sequence. Yeah, the essence of I don't know if that exists in capoeira. You got forms in that kind of way. Does that exist?
So yeah, so good question. I don't know if traditionally, let's say that by traditionally I mean like 100 years ago.
Yeah, that existed.
So,
right.
so what you have, let me start over. What you have in capoeira, in some capoeira traditions, are sequences or sequences of movement. I don't know if these existed 100 years ago.
Right. But then, okay.
Yeah, I in a lot of instances, based on a lot of what I've read and studied about capoeira in the 19th century capoeira, early 20th century capoeira, I really don't think that they existed because, again, to a large extent, the art wasn't codified. But certainly when Mr. Bimba begins to create capoeira regional, which is really his effort of reforming this traditional form of capoeira in Bahia, he does incorporate sequences in Portuguese into his training. And so you have all of these groups who claim a connection to Bimba's legacy, who will practice sequences, of varying composition. And even our group, Usmalanji Meshutora, we have sequencias. The sequencias, I would say that the biggest difference, as far as I could tell, like between sequencias in capoeira and sequencias or the forms in karate or kung fu. I'm more familiar with how I've seen like karate sequence, forms, and because I've done some Chinese martial arts, I've also learned some of those Chinese forms. There's a level of, like, I know, like in some of the Chinese arts that I did, like there was a level of abstraction to a lot of the movements in the form. Right. You really had to have somebody there to decode, that when you raise the arm that way, that's this. And when you do that, right. And in a lot of the capoeira groups where I've seen sequences, it's not really that abstract. It's that's like they do this kick, do this evasion, do this kick, do this evasion, do this move. It's like, so you don't take a whole lot of imagination to know what you're doing.
Okay, I understand.
But also I'll say this, the intent is, and I wouldn't say, I'm not going to say the intent is not similar in Asian martial arts. But in capoeira specifically, the intent is for people's study of these sequences to inform how they use the art in improvisationally. So that is.
This is what I was going to ask, right? Sorry, that's where I was going to go with it. I don't know how what I've just said in terms of sparring with an unwilling opponent. It manifests itself in capoeira because the principal form, it's a sparring martial art, whether for play or for combat, right? Like you're facing somebody and you're you know what I'm saying, you're exchanging, but there is no definitive like way that it's gonna run, if that makes sense. I'm saying it's literally a dance. So you're responding and reacting to what the person is doing, and this I'm saying. So so in real time. So that how does that, but then obviously because of the fact that oftentimes, as you said, a lot of people do it for play and it's not necessarily combat, I don't know the extent to which that is an asset or not as it relates to combat, right? That sparring dynamic, which is the dominant dynamic, is that an asset, or does the playfulness of it make it a liability? If that makes sense. Right,
it makes perfect sense. So I'll say that it's a dichotomy that doesn't exist in some capoeira traditions. So in our capoeira, like the capoeira that we do, as well as other groups, I've heard of a few other groups where I've encountered people who practice with those groups or members of those groups, where when they play capoeira, it's sparring. Like it ain't no, we're gonna play this pretty game, and elegant eyes, don't get kicked in the head, and if you don't get out of it, I could tell you some stories, man. I played some games with some people and caught some blows, some legendary blows, and took some falls because we're playing. We're not going to kill each other, but we are engaging in the practice of a martial art, and in order for there to be an element of realism. So let me say this: when you're sparring, and this is like really important. So sparring matters certainly in whatever martial art it is. Sparring helps you with timing, right? How I set something up in relation to what someone else is doing, distance. Right. You have this bad thing. You go on YouTube and you'll see people play capoeira from 6 feet, 7 feet away from each other. Well, you can't develop a good sense of distance like that. Right. you know, as well as I don't know, timing, distance, momentum, economy of motion, all those things, you know, force and deflection, redirection of force, all those things come into play when you spar, right? And for capoeira groups, and I know in our group certainly this is the case, when people play, you know, especially when people, you know, people play with contact, and generally people do, all those dynamics come into play. You know, where people get into close, now they're in a grappling situation. Now you got to redirect that, you know, body, you know, either with a takedown or something like that. So, or just or to create distance so that you can get back to striking. But you got to be able to strike with efficacy. That is, where those strikes hit with penetrative power. You know what I'm saying? So that you can either set up the next attack or disrupt whatever that planned attack was. You don't get any of that unless you make some degree of contact. You know, so if I just throw pretty kicks at you and you avoid the kicks, and you throw pretty kicks at me, or even don't avoid the kick because I'm 20 feet away from you, just doing basically in my own world doing movements. That's what you feel a lot of times. It's really not instructive of what martial or combative exchanges look like. And so fortunately, there are capoeira groups that do the Usmalange Mestre Toro. You know, we do that. My mestre is Mestre Toro, and Mestre Toro, I have to say, is an exponent of the martial tradition of the capoeira of Rio de Janeiro, right? And so his intent is to keep the art real. And in order to keep it real, you have to keep it true to its martial roots. Now, are all capoeiristas or capoeira groups committed to that? I don't believe so, based on some of what I've seen. But many, you know, are cognizant of that, and many are capable, and many you sort of have within their repertoire range of things that can be deployed in more violent situations. But to be sure, for some groups, that idea that when we play is without contact, you know, it's without intensity, and then that which is separate from sparring. And some groups, they're enmeshed. And our group is one of those groups. There are other groups like that as well, where it's enmeshed, where people they make contact, because that's a part of the learning.
Okay, my brother, I've got one more question, then we're going to open up the floor.
Sure.
I'm going to share the link for those who want to come through now. And if you don't want to come live, so you can click the link to come live, kings and queens. If you don't want to come live, you can ask your question in the chat, please, at gotkushTV, so I can know that you want a statement or a question read out. I'll start a couple already, so I'm going to come to those shortly. Yeah. Now, my brother, this is gotkushTV. Yeah. And we are a Pan-African media platform. So we cannot be here and discuss this particular subject without putting it in the context of African liberation and resistance, to oppression and slave colonization, right? And it's interesting. We speak about capoeira. You spoke already about its usage in the anti-colonial fight in Brazil. We've mentioned Kalinda, and the Kalinda art form, for those who are not aware, has a significant tradition in resistance to colonialism in Trinidad, you know, in particular in the legacy of Joe Talmana, and that also relates to the development of Carnival. So after that, you know, everybody's jumping and whining at Carnival, and you know what I'm saying, you know, enjoying the merriment of the white rum and all of these things, right? But very rarely connect it to the fact that it develops out of resistance to colonialism in Trinidad. This Kalinda art form is a central part of that resistance. So you mentioned Brother Rodnell and others, Sister Attila Springer and others, they do the Camboulet reenactment before Carnival every year in Trinidad, because that is the history that brings Trinidad into existence. So Kalinda is related to the history of Trinidad, of Carnival, and that martial form is an anti-colonial one. And so just from your studies and your research and your experience in these art forms, to what extent are they important in how we resist oppression, how we resist colonization, how we resist police brutality, whatever it is? How important are these forms?
I love that question. I'm gonna take a detour, and I'm gonna come back to the question. And hopefully, people understand the importance of the detour.
Go ahead.
You know, kung fu movies. One of the things that fascinates me about kung fu movies is that they're still fighting Japan. I don't know if you've noticed that.
Always,
still fighting Japan.
Trust me.
You see that in a lot of Korean cinema too. They're still fighting the Japanese. You know, one of the things that I think that we have to understand is that.
Sorry, my brother. Another ubiquitous theme is One China.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, I was just thinking about the movie Hero 2 weeks, 2 days ago. I wanted to go back and watch that movie, but that's the thing, Chinese unification. Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
So one of the things that has to be understood is that for many people, if not for all people, let's say start over, for all people, their cultural traditions are bases or their cultural traditions are key elements which informs their sense of the past as well as their notions of futurity. These traditions reinforce the sense of who they are. These traditions also articulate key elements of the imperatives of that group's survival, right? Oftentimes, in articulating the imperatives for the survival of that group, they also necessarily articulate the key impediments towards that group's survival, right? Which is why disunity and invasion are recurring elements in particularly in Chinese cinema, right? Martial arts cinema, right? This is very important.
Yeah.
With regards to our traditions, again, and I said all that just to make the point that this is not just us, right? That the other people understand the same thing, and some of us, I think, are perhaps behind the ball in terms of understanding the import of these traditions. Because I think if we understood the import of these traditions, many of them would not be endangered, and we would not be flocking to them because we would recognize the vitality of those traditions as constitutive of the coherence of our own Pan-African nationalist visions of future possibility. Why do I say that? Let's start with how these arts inform how we understand the past. And I really appreciate that you started with that. When I met Master Rondell Benjamin, again, he taught us a number of songs. This is at this Afro Diaspora Stick and Blade gathering event. There was a brother there from our capoeira group who teaches in Los Angeles. He's also an Ifa priest. He asked a question about a song that he learned during a time when he visited Trinidad in the past, and Master Rondell ran down the history of the song. This is a song that's sung in the context of the stick fight game of Kalinda, but it's also a song which connects to a key historical element in terms of the Afro-Trinidadian struggle. What has to be understood is that there is no separation between the art of Kalinda and the historical dynamics, the historical struggles of Black people on both of those islands, Trinidad and Tobago, from enslavement and colonialism. Same as capoeira, right? There's no separation. We talk about capoeira, we are necessarily talking about an art which is in fact a vehicle of African resistance. And so, so one of the things that these arts remind us, one of the things that they reinforce, is the reality of war, which was visited upon our ancestors, right? That not only the oppression which was imposed upon them, but the way that they engaged in constant struggle against it, right? Those arts remind us of that. Therefore, those arts become anchors of historical memory, which are profoundly important. The past, of course, the template upon which we develop or formulate our understandings of who we are in the present, right? Recognizing ourselves as an African people, those arts continue to give us a sense of who we are and what we should be striving for. I remember a friend of mine. She's not even African, but I remember a message. I don't know how I saw this message. I think it was on Facebook. She was exchanging with someone, and she said, "Doesn't capoeira teach us that we should always be fighting for freedom?" Right? She wasn't an African, but she understood. She got the message. She got the message, and indeed, capoeira, Kalinda, right? These traditions remind us that the struggle for African freedom is present and ongoing. And so what it does to do, it reminds us, in fact, that we are our ancestors, right? Why do I say that we are ancestors? If we are the people who have been born from them, if we are the people who have inherited their traditions, if we are the ones who have inherited the struggle that they left unfinished, we are indeed our ancestors, and our mission is to carry that struggle forward. So those arts, in fact, provide a mechanism towards a reinforcement of a particular type of consciousness as to who we are and who we have to be. And then also in terms of this vision of futurity. When those folks were fighting, right, utilizing all the tools that they had at their disposal, whether we're talking about Haiti, right, and then we didn't even get into Haiti and some of the various martial traditions there. Kalinda was also attested to in Haiti. Pingay, a style of wrestling, machete fighting, and so on. The point is that when those Africans were fighting in Haiti, and in Trinidad, and in Jamaica, and in Mexico, and in Brazil, they went out fighting so that their future descendants could be in a state of subjugation. They weren't fighting so that their future descendants would be in a state, a state of cultural confusion, right? Mistaking what Mwalimu Baruti calls sub-integration into Western societies as, in fact, a condition of freedom, because it is not. right? They were in fact fighting for, in many instances, the actualization of African sovereignty. This is why it's important to note that in many instances, there was a very close association between these martial traditions and the traditions of insurrection and maroonage, right? Throughout the diaspora.
Yes.
It's very interesting to me. Desh Obi writes about the word Quilombo, and Quilombo, he says, was a term that was used to describe these military units that were active in the northern part of Angola. And of course, in Brazil, the Quilombos become maroon societies. But again, what were the Maroons doing? Did they just sit up on a mountain hoping that the Europeans don't show up? No, they were waging war against the system of enslavement. They were waging war against the system of oppression, right?
Yes.
This is true in Haiti, this is true in Brazil, this is true in Suriname, this is true in the United States, wherever we were. And so in terms of the sense of futurity, these arts also remind us that the future, that in the future, it's kind of like that line from that movie Quilombo. Zumbi says, the war must end and victory for Palmares, right? I would argue that with these arts impress upon us in terms of the sense of futurity, that African people must be free. Right? That the struggle for African people must be waged until African people are sovereign. And the only meaningful basis upon which sovereignty can be actualized, or the only meaningful impetus by which we can sustain a struggle for sovereignty is on the basis of our own ancestral paradigms. And so to me, those arts are key in terms of creating this bridge of cultural continuity, conceptual continuity. I would also argue methodological continuity, because they were not petitioning for their freedom when they were engaged in insurrectionary struggle. They were not attempting to vote themselves into sovereignty when they were creating maroon societies. They were in fact engaging through word and deed in creating the structures requisite for African self-determination and freedom. So I would argue those arts are in fact signifiers of the African struggle for freedom. They're signifiers of how our ancestors attempted to preserve and sustain their humanity, and fundamentally linked to that idea of humanity was their right as African people to be sovereign in the world. And those arts, to me, are reminders of that.
Give him thanks, my brother. Give him thanks. All right, family. I've got more questions, but I'm a hold back. Yeah, you know what I'm saying. And brothers and sisters want to come true. King Kel, click the link again. Our brother. Now I'm not sure if it's Jedi or Jedi. Let me know if how I'm supposed to pronounce it, my brother.
Jedi. It's Jedi.
Okay. Good.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine, my brother. And by the way, brothers, I'm gonna give you a taste of Brother Rod now a little bit later on, yeah. You know what I'm saying? So you can get a vibe of what Brother Kamau is speaking about in terms of the chant wells, yeah, of Kalinda in Trinidad. But go ahead, my brother Jedi.
So, and thank you for this conversation. Very enlightening. I appreciate it. I'm so glad you guys are doing this, because you are educating the masses, brothers. So thank you so much. Thank you so much. Very nice. Quick question. So whenever I think of capoeira, I can't help but think about Haiti, 1804, the revolution in Haiti, abolishment of slavery, and how capoeira, our martial arts, may have played a part in how they employed it in Haiti in order to gain that freedom. If you can maybe speak to that a bit, and I'll go on mute. Thank you so much.
You know what? I don't know if I appreciate that question. There's a chat. I haven't even read it yet. There's a book chapter by TJ Desh Obi about Haitian machete fighting, and I can't recall in that chapter if he makes a connection to the revolutionary struggle. But I think many people do make connections to the revolutionary struggle and some of the martial traditions that exist in Haiti. You know, like I said, in Haiti. So let me go back. Right. So I'm not sure to what extent a capoeira-like tradition took root in Haiti, right? Given that doubtlessly they would have received a number of Africans from the Congo-Angola area, more than likely those martial cultures would have been there. But to the extent to which that became a coherent form that was transmitted across generations, I'm not sure. But what we do find in Haiti is certainly records of Kalinda. Again, I don't know if Kalinda is still practiced there, but certainly there are records of it, as well as machete fighting, right? Tir machete. One of the things so let me say this, like going back to what I said about capoeira. Again, I don't know if there was capoeira in Haiti, but when you read the accounts of the maroon and insurrectionary traditions in Haiti, you seem to find like a certain thing that we associate with capoeira, which is interesting to me, and I don't think it's by happenstance. So Jacob H. Carruthers, in his wonderful book, The Irritated Genie, he talks about how the French were expending numerous resources to eradicate the Maroons. Like, this is their key mission. The Maroons have to be destroyed, right?
Yeah.
So they're sending wave after wave after wave of army to crush the Maroons, but the Maroons would not be crushed. They would say that there were situations where they would pull out their guns and shoot at the Maroons, and the Maroons would disappear.
Yeah.
As if they vanished into thin air. And it's interesting to me because when I teach my students capoeira, like in capoeira, like I said before, you have esquivas, you have escapes or evasions. I tell my students that you should be like mist. The blow comes, you avoid the blow. It's kind of like a boxer who bobs or weaves, right? You know, the blow comes, you shouldn't even be there. I was just teaching my students this last night. I didn't use that phraseology this time, that idea of mist, but the idea of displacement of the body, right? And it was very clearly these brothers and sisters had the ability to displace the body. And also related to that, of course, the use of spiritual power, right? The extent to which their spirituality deeply informed the struggle. So, you know, and what we find in Brazil as well as in Haiti, you know, you find certainly, I mean, you got the Vodun tradition in Haiti, the Orisha tradition in Brazil, but in many instances, we're still talking about Shango, Ogun, Obatala, you know what I'm saying? Oya, and so forth. We're talking about many of the same divinities, these same principles. And so I think that, though I'm not sure to the extent to which a capoeira-like tradition, that is a derivative tradition of Ngolo, took root in Haiti and was transformed, it does seem to me that certain elements, certain things that we associate with capoeira took root there. That is the displacement of the body, right? Because these Maroons, you know, they wouldn't stand there and engage in standard 19th century, 18th century European warfare where two armies face each other and they just shoot at each other. No, these sisters and brothers engage in so-called guerrilla warfare, using their environment, using terrain, using attacks, techniques of escape and evasion, you know, which you find, you know, particularly the idea of evasion still being a part of capoeira, as well as their spiritual traditions, which again, when you go deep into this, the spiritual traditions, the spirituality of African people is fundamental in many of these traditions, capoeira, kalinda also being no exceptions to that. So I think those are probably elements where there was an interconnection. But I think if we were to highlight maybe two traditions that are probably have a direct connection to the revolutionary struggle, it would be tir machete, the Haitian form of machete fighting, and quite likely kalinda. Kalinda, let me say this, the last thing, Deshobi writes about this. He says that there were certain rituals associated with kalinda where when people would use it, they would either use certain types of wood or certain types of blades, and they would consider it something which possessed spiritual power, right? So you would have this idea in Brazil, they call it corpo fechado. Corpo fechado is the closed body, right? The idea that the body is impregnable to harm. Well, they would have similar traditions associated with these other traditions. You know what I'm saying? So again, I don't know to what extent the mechanics of an Ngolo-derived art sustained itself in Haiti, but to be sure, there were certain common cultural principles at play in Haitian martial cultures that were expressed in the revolutionary struggle and to varying extents have been sustained thereafter. I hope I answered your question.
You did, definitely. And what you've just, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing also is that when it comes to capoeira and the other martial arts, or should I say defense mechanisms that we have in the culture, in our African culture, there's a lot that's not actually been revealed yet. It's, in other words, there are layers to this thing. So there's that external capoeira that you see people doing, and they'll be in the park or they'll be in the gym and they'll do these things. But then there's also that battle hardened and ready form that is like, I will deal with you. So that's kind of what I'm
very much so. Dr. Edward Poe writes about this in his book, The ABC Beaba Capoeira de Angola. And again, this is from his time in Brazil back in the 60s. He said that, you know, he mainly studied with Pastinha, but at times he studied with other masters. And he says every master has secrets. You know, everyone has secrets.
Indeed.
You know, and it's, you know, it's a thing where everybody in that school may not even get the secrets. You know, some people may get some secrets, others may get other secrets. And so there is an element of secrecy, which is a part of our tradition, which is embedded. And I have not encountered an Afro-diasporic martial art yet where they in the tradition of secrecy, where some stuff is held back for reasons. You know what I'm saying? I've not encountered.
The other side to that, my brother, because we hear that the Abalaya Toya, the woman who trained
that's right, yes, sir.
Dessalines,
indeed.
You know what I'm saying, was she was the term's gone out my head, but she was a part of the,
I can't remember it either.
Anyway, Agoji, right? What's it called? Of Benin,
Okay.
And so she taught him a lot of things, right? You know what I'm saying, in terms of what it means to fight. She taught him a lot of things. So I was throwing that in there, Miss what you were saying, but go ahead, continue. Don't.
Yeah, no. I think I mean that's it. I think there's a tradition of secrecy, and I would say that for people who know, it would be ill-advised to offer any full presentation of those arts to people who are not a part of the community of practitioners, right? They're because for many different reasons, right? But yeah, I mean, and this is many of these traditions had traditions of secrecy, and I would say especially if we look at capoeira, the stuff. I mean, I think about this a lot, because there's even stuff that I know that I don't necessarily teach all my students because again,
right.
I have to be careful.
I have your stuff. I got you.
Exactly, and so it is a thing. I think one does have to be mindful of the fact that what do Black people say? There are layers to this. There are levels to this. So there are levels to this, and I think that's definitely true of these traditions as well.
Okay, so capoeira, both men and women.
Oh yeah. And it's when you look historically, it's interesting. Actually, that's a very good question. When we look at these traditions, like some, it seems like, especially when we go back in the past, that a number of these traditions, that probably most of these traditions, that the practitioners were predominantly male, and probably a number, if not most of these traditions, but across the board, we have a number of notable traditions where you had a very significant presence of women. I remember when we were at the Stick and Blade gathering in LA, Master Rendell talked about women in Calenda, in capoeira. Of course, you have a number of women who were, important practitioners, especially in the 20th century, a number of women who are mestras or masters of the art. In Desh Obi's book, Fighting for Honor, he talks about knocking and kicking, or I think it was headbutters he was talking about how you had, wrestlers. It was wrestlers. So what happened in the United States is that you had all these different martial traditions that existed alongside each other. So you had some people who were like, they did knocking and kicking, and that was really closed. So you had to be in certain lineages to get that information. Everybody couldn't get that information. But other non-martial knowledges like headbutting and wrestling were much more diffused, right? So when you think about, I think about how I grew up in the Black community. When I grew up, I saw people who boxed or wrestled. Those kind of knowledges are very diffused. Very rarely did I see, and again, I wasn't in the streets enough, but I didn't see people who were like, they knew how to use the straight razor, or they were, masters of, some kind of stick fighting. That martial arts knowledge would have been more esoteric to me. The point, though, is that Desh Obi talks about how among these wrestlers, and he's talking about in Georgia and South Carolina, that, you had a lot of men who were renowned, but there were a lot of women who were tough, who could take men down. Wow. And I think, I appreciate that you mentioned the sister who taught Dessalines, because one of the things that we see in our tradition, especially in the diaspora, women play a key role in that, because all of us were victims of European predation. All of us were victims of European violence. And so all of us have a vested interest in freeing ourselves, right? And so we don't have any time for anybody to be a civilian. Everyone has to be a warrior. All the warriors got to train.
What that brought to mind just now, there's a scene, it's possibly, it might be my favorite scene, in Aikwe Amar's book, 2000 Seasons, where the sisters go to work on some Arab enslavers, right? You know what I'm saying? But he goes into great detail, of how each one was taken out, right? And how they organized this. Hey, I got away with words, right? But the way how he wrote that scene, anyway, so that was powerful. My brother, feel free to stay where you are, brother Jedi. I do want to come to our questions in the chat. If you have a question from the chat, please at gotkushTV so I can see it and star it. Brother MA is asking for Brother Kamau, is it worth separating Ngolo from capoeira? For just explain the difference, or what is Ngolo different to capoeira first, and then you can answer the question.
So Ngolo, I would say the relationship between Ngolo and capoeira, it would be, it's hard for me to create an analogy for this, but it's analogous to the relationship between, traditions of drumming in West Africa and the diasporic derivatives, right? So Ngolo is clearly the parent. And so you find in Ngolo foot sweeps, the use of inverted kicks, the use of evasive techniques, all of that stuff gets brought over here into capoeira, danmie, knocking and kicking, and so on. And so obviously Ngolo is the foundation, but capoeira I think capoeira has differentiated itself from Ngolo in a couple of ways. One in terms of, let's say, for instance, the musical accompaniment, right? And so whereas Angola, I think traditionally was played in relation to a drum. By the time you get to the end of the 19th century of Brazil, 19th century in Brazil, the berimbau has taken a central place. So there's been an interesting shift in terms of instrumentation, as well as a number of West African instruments that are also sort of joined that. So there's a difference in terms of music. I will also argue there's certain differences in terms of technique. There seems like there are certain techniques that have been incorporated into into capoeira that perhaps were not a part of Ngolo initially. Right. And I would say that's more true even when we look at other traditions like Danmie, and Mani, where you have other types of weapons, that is, other types of ways that the body is being utilized in relation to those arts. Part of what I think has to be understood is that all martial cultures emerge in relation to both historical predeterminants, that is, they emerge out of certain martial cultures, but they're also responsive to certain social circumstances. And so one of the things, like if you take two of the weapons, like non-bodily weapons in capoeira, and especially in the 19th century, the straight razor, right? The straight razor and the knife, so the straight razor, of course, in the second half of the 19th century becomes the tool of the capoeira assassins, where people are using the straight razor in their hands, they're using it in their feet. You understand what I'm saying? That wasn't a part of Ngolo. That was purely a development in capoeira that happened in Brazil. Another element was the use of the blade, the knife. People would put the knife on the end of the berimbau, so that if you're at the capoeira game and it gets a little too wild and somebody got to get cut, they get cut. You know what I'm saying? You ain't got to dig in your pocket for the blade. You just cut them with the berimbau. And so I think there were a number of important adaptations that occurred in Brazil that augmented Ngolo, that added to it. And I think that's what differentiates it from capoeira. But again, so I would say the difference between capoeira and Angola is probably the analogous to the extent to which we are different from our great grandparents, right? We're certainly derivative of them. We're of them without a doubt, and much of what constitutes us comes from them. But there's a degree of separation based on time and space in many instances.
Am I incorrect in saying that there are those capoeiristas who practice an Angola form that is known to be slower? Is that correct?
Yeah. So you have what happened in Bahia when Bimba created his style of capoeira, which he called capoeira regional, the sort of regional style of capoeira. He was differentiating it from the traditional styles that were all around him. What people began to do subsequent to Bimba, since he was demarcating a particular type of techno-stylistic terrain, people began to refer to that traditional style as capoeira Angola, right? Okay. And so generally now in Brazil, people refer to the traditional capoeira, that is the capoeira that Bimba didn't create, and the capoeira that's not derived from Bimba's creation, or a subsequent hybridization of Bimba's creation and the traditional form as capoeira Angola. Now, the thing about capoeira Angola is tricky, because capoeira Angola, in some instances, you'll see people play it very slow because there's an emphasis on estratégia and malícia. Estratégia is strategy. Malícia is cunning and deception. And so a lot of times the slow play is in order so that people can really practice and express that cunning, that strategy. You'll see people, if you really watch some of these games, people will set traps for people. Yes. But that's just they call it Angola because they're saying it's derivative of the Angola tradition, but it's not synonymous with Angola. It's still distinct. And some people don't play it the same. Like there's some groups even in Bahia where their play looks very different than other groups in Bahia. Our style of capoeira, we call capoeira Angola de Sabento Grande. And so it's a capoeira style in Rio, not Bahia, but it's still called, again, capoeira Angola de Sabento Grande, because it's still considered a traditional style of capoeira, but it's also different, and from many of the traditional styles of Bahia, and we can play slow, but often we don't, and we often play with contact. So there's no uniformity or there's no standardization in terms of how capoeira Angola looks, because you have to remember. Most of what we know of as capoeira Angola today was derived from Mestre Pastinha. Many of his students went abroad and taught, or some of his students went abroad and taught. But there were many other masters of capoeira Angola, and even today, many who come from other lineages, because capoeira Angola expresses itself in different ways. Some where they play slow, some where they play fast, some where they play more aggressively than others.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you, my brother. But there's a glaring elephant in the room that I have to ask about. And I got another question from the chat. This is your last chance, brothers and sisters. We're coming to the end of the show. So if you want to come live with our brother Kamau Rashid, please click the link now, or forever hold your peace. But yeah, there's a glaring elephant in the room, my brother. You're using all these Portuguese terminologies, yeah,
Yes,
within the context of our African martial art. It's Wagwan. And by the way, Joy, I should also say, yesterday we had a chance to read from some works of Baba Kimbwande the Kiabu Seki Fukiao. So we will know that the term Ungola relates to terms like power and force, yeah. And them kind of things there, right? But we have such beautiful language, yeah, within Kikongo and other Central African languages. Why are we trapped with all of these Portuguese terms within an African martial art?
That's a great question, and all of it. I mean, absolutely, all of it has to do with the context. The fact that the art was developed, in Brazil. It's just like if we look at any of these Afro-diasporan traditions, the technical names for the technique, like you go to Martinique, the names for things are probably going to be either in Creole or in French. In the U.S., like I know in Knocking and Kicking in 52 and Jailhouse, the names are all in English. It's a consequence of historical circumstances. There are people, however, kind of to your question, because I'm sort of reading into your question, there are people who are advocates of the re-Africanization of the arts themselves, right? And I think this is interesting because what happens in the diaspora. And you see this especially like with the spiritual traditions, with the music and dance traditions, you know what I'm saying, where these things are mediated or they're characterized by what people refer to as syncretism, sort of this intermingling or this adoption of non-African cultural forms, and as a vehicle for the mediation of an African cultural expression. But there are some people who argue that type of syncretism is no longer necessary, and that those traditions themselves should be re-Africanized. So I do know of at least one person where I think they sing Yoruba songs, you know what I'm saying? They sing Akan songs. He calls the techniques the Obadele Kambine in Ghana, Dr. Obadele Kambine. He calls the techniques by African names. And I think that I've seen. Seems like I saw somebody in the U.S. who was doing something similar. They weren't calling it capoeira. They were, which maybe an African term. We may or may not be. We're not sure where that word comes from, but they were calling it something else that had clearly like this Congo connection. So there's some people who have advocated for that. I would say that for let me say this, like for me, the European languages are problematic, right? I see them just like Sheikh Anta wrote about in Black Africa, they're fetters. They're fetters of the degree to which we are still colonized, our civility, our servility or subjugation by other peoples. But there's the other dimension is that the communities of practitioners from which these arts emanate, they also speak these languages. And so there's also part of the challenge as well. Right? So if I go to Brazil or if I'm interacting with mestres from Brazil, I'm going to have to use Portuguese in order to be understood. So I think that, but I think it is healthy for us to think like, how do we conceptualize re-Africanization more broadly? That is, we should be having these conversations in Yoruba or Kikongo, right? Sure. I think if we begin to advance that as a type of politic, we may find that many of the Africans in these places are also amenable to these ideas.
100%, my brother. There was a question that actually came up yesterday, in fact, in relation to even the term martial arts, because the term martial is derived from the Roman war deity, right? Mars, and I remember, and I don't recall who, but for some reason, Ashra Quays is in my head. He was the African origin of martial arts and wrestling in particular, and he referred to it as Montu arts, which is a combat principle within ancient Kemetu cosmology. So, like I say, we speak English, right? So we're going to use the terminologies that relate to this. But I mean, is there, for example, many of us are beginning to use the term Kimoyo to refer to African spirituality, right? I'm saying in general, like, is there viability in doing a similar thing when it comes to African martial arts, finding some kind of terminology that speaks to them, what they are holistically, as you've explained, in terms of transmissions of culture, healing arts, and them kind of things there?
Oh, I definitely believe so. Yeah, and you know, so yeah, the I really appreciate that you pointed that out in terms of Mars, because martial comes from the word Mars, which is the Roman, the Greco-Roman deity of Ares was what the Greeks called him, god of war. You know, so we're invoking, right, European cosmologies. Isn't that interesting? We're invoking European cosmologies when we speak that language. When we say martial arts, when we say Thursday, when we say Friday, when we say that even the names of the week, the names of the week. And this is why, of course, languages are very important, very critically important vehicles of re-Africanization. So yeah, I do think that it is useful. And sometimes, like I'll say combat arts, or fighting traditions or fighting arts. You know, most of the time I think I'll use martial arts because it's the type of there's a concept, there's a schema that exists in the minds of people in terms of when you say martial art, you mean a certain thing. You know, and I'm not sure if other language, combat art, fighting traditions, if it sort of activates that same schema, if people see them as being synonymous. But to me, kind of like going back to what I said previously, I think ultimately the place to go is to conceptualize these things in our own languages. Like I said, about the combat, I believe I think he refers to asako, I think is the word he used, asako, which I think is a war dance, a term and a con term and a Shanti Chief term, a war dance. And I've variously that like every now and then I've toyed with simply calling it sana yamapigano, sana yamapigano being art or arts of sana yamapigano would be art of fighting in Kiswahili. Sana za mapigano I think would be arts of fighting, plural. But yeah, I do think that would be, I think that is a place, because I think that what is Jacob H. Carruthers saying? Meta nature that African champions must break the chains that link African ideas to European ones and listen to the voice of the ancestors without European interpreters. And I think that we have to unfetter or unshackle African concepts, from European paradigms. And so language, of course, is the obvious vehicle for that. So I do think we do that. And it doesn't have to be one term, right? So there's this interesting pattern that I've observed among like Africans today. And you see this play out on social media sometimes where somebody they'll thank somebody in Yoruba, they'll congratulate in Ashanti in Twi, they'll greet them in Wolof, and it's like all in this big thread. I was like, it's sort of this Afro-linguistic gumbo. Very African. And so we can have a number of terms as long as we're clear about their intent is for these things to holistically represent the combative traditions of African people, right? And that they're aligned to this political project that these arts, I would argue, are an extension or an expression of.
Yes. All right, brother Jadorian, well done, because you just come to what was going to be my last question. So stay tuned, we're going to get that answered. But brother Jada, we're moving to the close of the show. I'm going to give you a last word should you choose to use it.
Well, basically, when you sit and listen, you learn so much. Being immersed. First of all, I love Got Kush. I mean, I've been following Got Kush for a couple of years now and supporting it.
Thank you very much,
it's when we can link ourselves. Like I'm in New Mexico. I believe you're across the pond, right? You're somewhere else. So we're linking and having these conversations together. It's just basically exploding our consciousness of who we are. So when we talk about languages and how we correlate English, we correlate Portuguese, we correlate these things, we're correlating them to our terms and our concepts. But then we're taking it another step by recognizing the Yoruba, the Kiswahili. I recognize, like living here in the States, that my first language is not English. My first language would be Kiswahili or perhaps Yoruba, right? Depending on, where my line comes from. And so I kind of feel like we have to make that okay. We have to take it to the next level and make that okay. So I just want to say thank you guys.
Thank you very much, my brother. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate you. And still feel free to listen in as we close out the show. All right.
All right.
Peace out. All right, family. I am going to do two things. I'm going to ask Brother Kamau one last question. Before I do so, I'm gonna share something with the people them. Yeah. So we're going. Let's get a little vibes over here. All right. So stay tuned. All right. And so I'll explain it little piece after I've shared it. But stay tuned, yeah. Okay. So take it this.
Uganda is going to call those energies, those positive energies of our ancestors who fought for us to have this carnival, this Freedom Day. Keegan.
Ashe. Captain Breakamanda Pume Mary Vela Joe Tamana. Captain Breakamanda Pume Mary Ve Joe Tamana. Where you went, crazy woman? Where you went, Joe Tamana? Where you went, sassy osa? Where you went, Joe Tamana? Captain Beckamanda Pume Mary Vela Joe Tamana. Captain Beckamanda Pume Mary Vela Joe Tamana. Where you went, crazy woman? Where you went, Joe Tamana? Oh, let's sing this. Sing, 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 Joe Tamana. Captain Beckamanda Pume Mary Vela Joe Tamana. Captain Beckamanda Pume Mary Vela. Captain Beckamanda Pume Mary Vela. Oh, Captain Beckamanda Pume Mary Vela. Sing, 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 Mary Vela Joe Tamana. Mary Vela Joe. Mary Vela. Mary Vela. Mary Vela. Mary Vela. Mary Vela, Mary Vela. One more. Let me go. Hey, Captain Beckamanda Pume Mary Vela. Captain Beckamanda Pume Mary Vela. Sing it, sing it. Hey, Captain Beckamanda Pume Mary Vela. Oh, Captain Beckamanda Pume. Sing it loud. Hey, sing Mary Vela, Joe. Mary Vela. Ah, Mary Vela. Ah, hey, Mary Vela. Give me. Hey, Mary Vela. Mary Vela, Mary Vela, Mary Vela. Ashe, we welcome everyone. Welcome all the ancestors and all the stick fighters here and there and everywhere. Ashe.
Ashe.
All right. So I just thought let me share that quickly. Yeah. So let's explain Wagwan Deso. Yeah, that was in Trinidad. And a few years ago, two of the most high profile soca artists of our generation, Marshall Montano and Bunji Garlin, came together to do a song. Yeah. Now the history is that Bunji Garlin and Marshall Montano were locked in a feud, yeah, for a number of years prior. All right, beef, right? But they had resolved their differences and they came together to do the song together. But the song was a tribute to the Kalinda tradition. Okay, and so they brought in the brother that was singing, Keegan, and Rodnell, who we mentioned earlier, Benjamin, who we mentioned earlier, yeah, in relation to the history and the tradition, yeah, and so that was a conversation that they were holding about the song and its meaning. What Keegan was chanting was what is called a chantwell, yeah, which is when Kalinda competitions, for want of a better terminology, are taking place. These are the songs that are being sung by the people that are responsible for that music and that energy that you were speaking about earlier. Yeah, and the names that you're hearing in the song. So Captain Baker was a governor, colonizer of Trinidad. Yeah, and Joe Talmana is an ancestor who led a resistance against Captain Baker. This is tied up with the history of Carnival, and there are other ancestors that are being named within the song as well. Okay, and so I'm just pointing out because you mentioned the singing that is associated with Kalinda.
Yes, sir.
So then the last question that I wanted to ask you, because you said that you're focusing on the thing in terms of its healing as a healing modality, not as a martial art, so to speak. All right, and this relates to Jadorian's question. I'm going to ask his question and then put some spice on it if I need to. Yeah, he said, how do you understand African combat arts in relation to the healing arts, particularly in relation to feelings of incompleteness or being out purpose? Yeah, so I really just wanted you to emphasize where you're going with this in terms of these forms and really rituals as healing arts and not just art. So you can answer Jadorian's question in that context as well.
Appreciate that. So actually, I wrote a paper about this. It was published in the Journal of Black Studies last year. You can Google it. It's called "You Got to Be the Medicine to Heal the Community: Capoeira and the Art of Healing Mind, Body, and Spirit." And that first line, "You got to be the medicine to heal the community," that's from my capoeira master, Mestre Perduvilla. And so this is a wonderful question because this question actually relates to, I think even my own evolution as a practitioner of capoeira, because again, when I was interested in capoeira, when I first became interested in it at the end of the 90s, I was interested in it just as a martial art, something, how do you fight with this thing? Right. And that stayed my interest all throughout the 2000s and into the 2010s. But there was a point somewhere in the 2010s where I began to think about it. My thinking began to shift in relation to the art. And there were a number of people, there were at least two people, Dr. Edward Poe and Mestre Portovello, who each sort of pushed my thinking about this, just in terms of how they would talk about capoeira and the significance of capoeira, the import of capoeira. And so to that end, like, yes, I think fundamentally these arts are about healing. I think in order to understand this, we have to understand what healing is. But perhaps before we can get into that, we have to understand what is illness, what is unwellness, right? And Foucault talks about this in Self-Healing Power and Therapy, and he talks about that among the Congo people. Historically, illness was conceived of as being social in nature, right? And it doesn't take a lot of imagination to understand that when you look at the malaise of African people, wherever we find ourselves in the world, that many of the maladies that we experience collectively as well as individually are born of the condition of African people, right? Rather the things which afflict, whether they are things which afflict the mind or the body, that our condition under European domination is a key factor in terms of the salience of these things as bases of suffering in our lives. And so if illness itself is something which in many instances has a social basis, and healing, in fact, is something which has a social basis, and the question becomes, what role do these arts play in that healing project? And I would argue that they operate on several levels. And I lay this out more expansively in the paper, but succinctly, one of the things that they do, the first thing that they do is that they deal with the type of alienation that is born of an environment where African people are subject to the process of what Kobe Combine called cultural misorientation, right? That these traditions, these Black traditions, that they counter the invidious cultural misorientation that so afflicts the African mind under European domination. And that goes back to my point. They remind us of who we are. They remind us of who we are, our historical legacy, our connections to that legacy, and the forward, and our role in the continuation of that legacy. So that cultural misorientation, which manifests itself as a type of unknowingness as to who we are, as to what our purpose is. No, they anchor us, they ground us in that, right? Traditional societies, the organization and structure of traditional societies via their communal essence negated the type of alienation that is experienced in societies like these, because one of the things that they gave to each individual was a clear sense of identity, purpose, and direction, right? And so those traditional cultural forms also facilitate the same thing. So argue one first, that these arts, they anchor us to a sense of who we are in terms of being African, what our purpose should be. And then it enables us to interrogate everything that's happening around us, everything that's before us and everything that's behind us through that framework. So one, it serves as a means of countering the type of alienation born of cultural misorientation. Two, they become ways of us engaging, they become ways of us of us transforming the body and the mind, right? These arts, and I talk about this in the paper, because a lot of times when people think about these arts, they think about the body. And yeah, indeed, they do impact the body, right? They do facilitate the transformation of the body. I've had students who told me that they lost weight just from doing capoeira. Capoeira was their catalyst for getting in shape. And that's great. But I would call that a secondary or tertiary benefit of practice in the art. This is kind of the stuff capoeira does in the process of being practiced. But it helps condition the body. But it also, another type of conditioning is that it also, any martial tradition helps to encode certain types of automatic responses within the body. I've had this thing that happens in the house. In fact, it happened yesterday. I went in the refrigerator, I moved something, it fell, and I caught it before it hit the floor. That's the martial arts. That's just the martial arts. You know what I'm saying? And capoeira, 52, whatever. There's all those different arts and how they augment your hand-eye coordination. So a lot of times, so they augment our hand-eye coordination, so they wire the body in certain ways, but they also transform the mind. What do I mean by that? They enable us to see things more expansively, right? One very explicit thing is threat assessment. They enable us to assess threat, but more expansively, they enable us to read situations and people, which I would argue is fundamental to health. Because if we're in a situation or if we're around people who are antithetical to our well-being, we have to have the ability to size up the situation and respond accordingly. We cannot lack discernment.
Yes, sir.
And a comprehensive practice of these combat traditions teaches effective discernment, because your effective discernment could be a basis of your survival. And then the third thing is that they facilitate. It was something else I was going to say, but it got away from me. But I'll say they facilitate our engagement, our immersion within communities. They in fact are facilitative of community formation. And so so community, of course, becomes a basis of well-being, becomes a support system in very specific and material ways, but it becomes a basis of immaterial support in ways. People who care for us, and the consciousness of knowing that there are people who care for us, and the importance that has in terms of promoting a sense of well-being. So again, I would argue that, in terms of healing physically, in terms of our bodies, mentally, in terms of our minds, spiritually, in terms of our connection to our communities and our ancestors, that they're really holistic vehicles. I write about this more expansively in the paper. You know what I'm saying? So doubtlessly, I've missed some really important points that come up in that. But succinctly, I would answer that way, that these arts are vehicles of healing. I would argue these arts are vehicles of healing just as much as our dance and music and song traditions are, just like our food traditions are, just like, our traditions of social organization. All these things are vehicles of healing. Why? Because they are vehicles designed to create holistic support systems in which we exist as human beings. These systems which some people have engaged in determined efforts to eradicate.
Yes, my brother, this has been a beautiful conversation. And we have a show called gotkushTV University, where we just profile scholars, and so I'm looking to shoot new episodes of this in early next year. And what I'll do is I'll holler at you. There's a particular format for quality control, so I'll make sure that it's in sync, so you know what it's got to look like. We'll see if we can arrange for you to do a presentation on your paper.
Yes, sir.
You know what I'm saying, for that, so you can get into more detail on that subject. But thank you for joining us. I'm sure brothers and sisters have got a lot from it. Just give me a signal in the chat, brothers and sisters, if you've gotten a lot from brother Kamau Rashid this evening, this afternoon, depending on where you're at. You know what I'm saying? Give me a 9 in the chat. Type 9 in the chat if you're loving this conversation right here. Thank you, brother Kamau. I've kept you over time, so I'm gonna let you go. Let me just say this though. I missed a comment. It's not a question, but just to shout out. I'm sure it's his sister Danny. Our sister who has an MMA background, and she teaches women self-defense. So she said, I teach women self-defense, mixing different martial art forms and techniques for practicality to attack and get away. My background is MMA. Where can I learn capoeira? In London, UK. So I have some information in the sense of, I was sent some information from another sister who is a practitioner. And so I will leave that in the chat, in the comment section to this video, for you, Sister Danny. But thank you for tuning in. It's a pleasure, it's an honor, and so on. So any last words, Brother Kamau, before we let you go?
No. I just really first again, I want to say Asante Sana to you, good brother, for inviting me on. I always, I really greatly appreciate the work that you're doing in the battle for the battle for the African mind, or in the war for the African mind. You're definitely on the front line, and so I definitely appreciate that work and that sacrifice. And to our people, our community, one of the things that I think is important to understand is that African combat traditions, like all martial traditions, like all combat arts, are tools of self-protection. But our traditions have an added element, which is that they are anchors in terms of African historical and cultural consciousness. And so if you're able to learn an African martial art, I encourage you to do so. Some of you, like if you're in a place where there's not a teacher, if you're able to travel, if you're able to travel, certainly, do so. There are a number of great teachers in Brazil, in the Caribbean, in the United States, on the continent, in a variety of traditions. It's important to understand African martial traditions are comprehensive. Blade arts, stick arts, boxing arts, wrestling arts, and so on. There are many, many, many martial traditions. And I think it is important to emphasize that each of us plays a potential role in terms of both the internalization of these knowledges, but also the preservation of these knowledges, because some of these traditions are in jeopardy. And so some of you, if you think about your own ethnic or cultural or national background, you may very well come from a place where those traditions have either disappeared or are in jeopardy. And again, if you are of a mind and get engaged in those practices, I'm certain that there are people who would very much be appreciative of your willingness and desire to be a steward of those traditions.
Thank you very much again, brother Kamau. No doubt, yeah, there's more to go into, so we'll have you back again for another conversation.
Definitely. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, take care. Yeah, brothers and sisters, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna give you a little piece more of that from Brother Keegan as we close out. He gives an explanation of the chant that he was just doing, so I'm gonna give you that as the the exit music, so to speak, and we'll conclude at another point. So I should say reconvene at another point as well, kings and queens. All right. So again, thanking all those who tuned in. Appreciating all those who came live or asked questions in the chat and contributed to the flow of the conversation and made it more rich. Do stay tuned for more Zivanayi next week, Tuesday or Jimma Day, same time, 8 p.m. UK time. 3 p.m. EST, and situate yourself from there as and where you are in the rest of the world. And as I said previously, I have an announcement coming up at the end of the month in relation to programming for the month of December. Okay, so much appreciated to you all, and let me give you a little snippet of the calendar vibes in Trinidad as we close out. All right.
Tell them all this stink and dirty. Viking. Double M.
Keegan is going to call those energies, those positive energies of our ancestors who fought for us to have this carnival, this Freedom Day. Keegan.
Ashe. Captain Break Commander Pume Mary Velo Jotamana. Captain Break Commander Pume Mary Ve Jotamana. Where you went, crazy woman? Where you went, Jotamana? Where you went, sassy osa? Where you went, Jotamana? Captain Break Commander Pume Mary Velo Jotamana. Captain Break Commander Pume Mary Velo Jotamana. Where you went, crazy woman? Where you went, Jotamana? Oh, let's sing this. Sing, Jotamana. Captain Break Commander Pume Mary Velo Jotamana. Captain Break Commander Pume Mary Ve. Captain Break Commander Pume Mary Velo. Oh, Captain Break Commander Pume Mary Ve. Sing, Mary Ve. Jotamana Mary Ve. Mary Ve, Lord. Mary Ve. Mary Ve, Lord. Mary Ve. Mary Ve. Mary Ve. One more. Let me go. Hey, Captain Break Commander Pume Mary Ve. Captain Break Commander Pume Mary Ve. Sing it. Hey, Captain Break Commander Pume Mary Ve. Oh, Captain Break Commander Pume. Sing it loud. Hey, sing Mary Ve. Mary Ve. Bah, Mary Ve. Bah. Hey, Mary Ve. Give me. Hey, Mary Ve. Mary Ve. Mary Ve. Mary Ve. Ashe, we welcome everyone. Welcome all the ancestors and all the stick fighters here and there and everywhere. Ashe. As Marshall said, I consider myself a student of Trinidad and Tobago culture, Trinidad and Tobago tradition, and about, as a martial artist for many years, I always, love combat and learning. But at a point in time, I put on a Japanese gi and I watch myself in the mirror and I say, this is not looking like me. I want my tradition. I want to know what Africa, I want to know what Trinidad looks like. And that's when I started looking inwards and saw Trinidad and Tobago stick fighting. I journeyed into the community of Moruga with my colleague Rondell Benjamin, and we started trying to understand what stick fighting was about. And we learned that stick fighting was more than just what people say, two fellas trying to bust each other head, drunk men in front of a rum shop, drinking punch, or whatever. We realized it was a martial tradition or a martial art form that was highly skilled, and the things within it the so-called rituals, the understanding, the teaching, how you eat, how you think, how you prepare yourself, we started realizing that there was so much more to this game and so many benefits. But more importantly, I have to say, as a musician, as a songwriter, as a performer, what really drew me to it was the language. Because I used to sing soca calypso, and this one day, I was passing on the wharf, headed to a gig, and I heard these drums, and I stopped off on the wharf, and I went into the Gael, and I started singing with the drummers and the Lavwe people, the Chantwell, and I felt like it took me away. I didn't go to my gig, and it just took me away for about 7 years, away from calypso, away from soca, and I've been in that tradition, learning from the masters like King Stokely, King Kali, King Kongobar. These are the men that Lavways are written about, songs are written about. And I'd also like to recognize somebody in the audience today, Mother N2, Pearl N2 Springer, who is...
Did you know that you can pee out blood sugar? It's a brand new method people are using to achieve healthy A1C level.
She took me under her wings more than 7 years ago and guided me through the tradition as a female, as a mother, because it's men showing me the game, but have a female element. It's our days I come with my finger damaged, my elbow come out of place, I cut on my face, I bust head. And she would, there's a maternal feeling when you're like, something that you will never understand how a mother feels when you see a child bleeding and how important the mother is to the community. So all of those things the tradition teaches you and how all those things interplay. So coming forward now, I reached that point where I was like, okay, I want to do something more for calendar. We formed something called the Boa Academy, and the Boa Academy was about continuously researching, archiving, and digging up the information about calendar and bringing it to the fore, because we wanted to move it away from this bossed thing in front of bar to show people what we were seeing in it, a real African tradition rooted here. As another mother of ours said, it's like a vase that we have to put together, that the tradition that the Africans, enslaved Africans, left for us. Once we put that together, we will find things, and we're seeing that here now. We're seeing what we find in it, and as we go deep, as Marshall always telling us, we have to go deep. So this journey now has begun to go deep. Bringing it to the now, we wanted to make calendar mainstream, as you would say. And 3 or 4 years ago, Marshall walked into the studio around Precision Productions and Casey, and we were recording the Lavways because we wanted to record the Lavways of the old ones before they die out. So we have over 300-400 different songs, sit down, video archive. We're just building the archives. And we were leaving and Marshall was coming in and he said, what going on here? What going on here? And
tell them all the stink and dirty, stink and dirty. Viking. Double M.
Black Friday deal? Sorted. Save up to £250 per booking. TUI. Live happy.
Very hard work, where we have recognized through the education we receive from our elders, like Mother N2 and Mother Marian and Moruga, that we, the unbroken, must step forward again, because we are unbroken people. And calendar is a demonstration that we never broke. The unbroken people with a tradition that never died, with history that never disappeared. Right? Because you could find calendar in Brazil and you could find calendar in Louisiana. Right? We do not understand the depth and breadth of what is in our hand. And, I travel and I've been to places where Japanese samurai kendo masters were blown away by what we were doing with a stick. But in Trinidad, Master Drummer Leon and several of my elders are treated as if they do exist. So to be honored by these two gentlemen to bring forth the culture once more and place it at a pinnacle moment in our carnival celebration, for us means more than any words that we could utter would describe. Olive is one of the oldest patois lavways in record. All right, if you look at the Lomax recording, there's a copy of Olive in 1912 or 1902, I'm not sure the exact date. right? Olivier speaks of something that a lot of people are missing. Olivier, the song goes, Olivier na bois, Olivier ve na bois, menanu na bois, metanu na bois. Sing Olivier ve na bois, sing Olivier mayo. Sing Olivier grandeur. Menanu na bois, menanu na bois. Menanu ma bois, menanu na bois. Sing Olivier mayo. Sing Olivier grandeur. Menanu na bois, metanu na bois. Olivier is stick or stick fighting. I am stick. I am a stick fighter. We are stick, the people of the stick. Olivier is great. Olivier is magical. Sing, Olivier. We are the people of the tree, the people of the stick. They understood what that meant. The Olivier tree is a majestic tree, a special tree. People don't even know there's a hardwood that is built house with. But it is also a flexible wood. There's 4 varieties of Olivier trees. The one that they speak about in Kalinda is what you call a wap stick. Kalinda was played with sticks that would flex. Anare and Olivier and green guava were the fundamental sticks used to play the game. And for a stick man, like, what's this wizard? The one that is having King Arthur. Merlin. Every wizard had a wand, right? And every non-English speaking territory in the Caribbean, African men with sticks would be automatically locked up. Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Cuba, anywhere you go, check the history. We always knew and mastered the stick because we were people of the tree. The tree is sustainable, it's earth, it's life, it's love. Metal was not our preferred weapon because a tree could heal you, it could hurt you, it could help you, it could guide you, it could prop you up as you get older, it could help you dig out some yam when you're in the forest hunting. So the song speaks deeply to the origins of our people, the origins of our form, and how our people identify deeply with the stick and the culture of stick. Haiti's unbroken people traveled all the way from Haiti, throughout the Caribbean, through Trinidad, all the way to Venezuela. And if you trace carefully the history of Kalinda, it travels with these people. So this is a maroon gift to us in Trinidad. The Cimarron people, the blend of the native Indian, the African, and the escaped enslaved whites. Kalinda is more than just one thing, it's plenty things, because Kalinda means a collection of songs. It don't mean fighting with a stick. Some translations means it is the way of the drum. Look at that now, look how powerful this collection of technology that has been handed down for over 500 years, because there's reported witnesses in the late 1400s speaking about Musundi. In Haiti, it's still mentioned as Musundi. And somehow it magically morphed.
Every year in the month of May, we chant liberation. We gather every year in the month of May, cause we are one black nation. And we celebrate all our victory and prepare for each new fight. We vanquish you all down, Greta, whether black, yellow, brown or white. Cause black struggle international in this year time, and we want liberation now. After we struggle, I go in North America, me say we want liberation now. After we struggle, struggle, I go in a Caribbean. Me say we want liberation now. After we struggle, I go in a Canada. Me say we want liberation now. After we struggle, I go in a South America. Me say we want liberation now. After we struggle, I go in a Europe. Me say we want liberation now. After we struggle, I go in a Britain. Man, me say we want liberation now. After we struggle, I go in a Asia. Me say we want liberation now. After we struggle, I go in a Australia. Me say we want liberation now. And so we trot down the road and it a cause sensation. Behind the colors of the new black nation, I step into the valleys in the shadow of the wicked, just a chant liberation. Tell it to the nation what we want to see is Africa strong and free. We sing it in a reggae song all the time. The what is to be has got to be. Africa shall be free. Who are we? Africans. What do we want? Freedom. And we say, how do we get it? Fight. We must fight to defend the truth and defend the right. It's Africa. Liberation Day. The true black spirit is here to stay. Before this power, no one life is dear. Freedom come, what me? Freedom come, what me? And the wife them who were standing by were watching fearful, wondering, saying, who are these people who walk so proud? Who are these people who chant so loud? Are these not they who live in darkness and to whom we have given light? Are these not the sons and daughters of the savage who we have taught to read and write? Have we not taught them our history and honor them with our culture? And brought them into our great house to serve and stand at our great table. Have we not granted them what they deserve? Well, African proverbs say that only those who can listen can learn, and who can hear go and feel. We are the sheep of Jah pasture, and now we shall inherit our land. And we are also the lion, against who none shall stand. We are the sons and daughters of the original nation that gave to this world first knowledge of civilization. We were the victim of the white savage to whom we stretch out our hand, and not knowing they came to plunder, kill and slave our people and destroy our land. So now we step it down the road and it a cause sensation. Behind the colors of the new black nation and a one chance liberation. And we say, who are we? Africans. What do we want? Freedom. And we say, how do we get it? Fight. We must fight. We defend the truth and defend the right. This is Africa. Liberation Day. A true black spirit is here to stay. Before this power, no one life is dear. Freedom come, what me? A freedom come, what me? A freedom come, what me? What me?